and McCann.
Greetings. Welcome to Wake the Dead. Today we are very happy to be sharing our evening with a good friend, Carrie Olaje. Welcome.
Really happy to be here.
Well, we are delighted to have you. You are continuing with us on this deep dive of exploration. Our last show, you described the Mothers of Darkness and the ritual that you endured. And you were able to teach us about why. I mean, even the fact that it was held in Washington, D.C., oh, that's why they got a big obelisk in Washington, D.C., so that they can do this ritual in this huge space with these baby girls that are wrapped up in linens and like drowned in this blood water, right? After they're raped by a golden phallus and 3 girls are sacrificed for you and you're wrapped up in linens like a mummy and you're forced to watch. So people should listen to that episode. It's horrific and very informative, and we thank you so much for sharing with us, and we're very happy to not happy. We are blessed though to hear this. Sorry, we have a little bit of a delay, so I'm gonna do my best to keep that in mind. So okay, today we are going to continue with the Mothers of Darkness, and we're also going to be talking about the programming, what their intent was. Like we went over what they did, and now we're going to go over like why and all that stuff, and then structures of the internal hierarchies and the relations of the external hierarchies, and we got some notes. It's all good. So we're gonna get into it. Okay. And we thank you. Wonderful. Yes.
Thanks so much, Sean. I mean, yeah, I know it's normal to get like a little awkward, I would say, when trying to figure out how to like address talking about these subjects and stuff, because it is very, I try and stay as like rational and lighthearted as possible so that we can, get through it. But also it's hard to say that, we're looking forward to having a conversation about this like very dark and horrible stuff, but it's like, it's the reality of processing it and being able to move on for how it affected me, growing up, especially, but also, like I said before, part of why I am so explicit in describing rituals like that is to give people a really good picture, but also to really like tell the story of like those, it's telling my story, but in doing so, it's telling the story of like those 3 little girls, for example, who like, would have like, died and been forgotten about if I wasn't here, talking about my testimony and really trying to like remember what I went through, but like what so many others that I saw went through. And I think that, this is the first episode we've mentioned notes. So I think it's a great idea. We can finish up anything about the Mothers of Darkness programming, the ritual events, that being like the first one that I went through that kind of inducted me into that order of, occult, magically based, women, essentially. I do think some of them are psychopaths and some of them would fall into like the DID category. But you know, that aside, like it kind of does it does flow into what we wanted to talk about today as well. I feel like where it's just going to be going into kind of the nitty gritty of understanding what programming is, what internal systems are, and like how like all of this ritual stuff, all the trauma in general, how it really serves a purpose when you're molding a slave and their internal world triggers, all the different things that actually like create the enslavement in their mind, but also like the access and power that the handlers, the programmers end up having over, over the victim, over the mind controlled slaves, life and actions and emotions and internal, world, um, all that stuff basically. So yeah, I think I'm really glad to be here and to be doing something kind of closer to what I do on my channel, which is just kind of focusing on like educating and helping people to conceptualize like very difficult to really like picture and understand concepts, I guess.
Please tell us about your show. Let's start there, and so people can learn more, and other survivors who are lost and need direction, and need to hear from someone else.
Yeah.
You're there for them too, and please tell us about where they can find you.
Yeah, so my channel is Desert Dakini. That's Dakini, a survivor's perspective. Or you can just find me by at Carrie Olaje on YouTube. Right now, I only have stuff on YouTube. I plan to have that change in the future. But the whole purpose of my channel has really never been to focus on my testimony, which I've obviously, done a lot of interviewing on your show for, and like the imagination. That essentially I wanted to create a channel that is meant for survivors, especially ones that are like newer in their healing. It's kind of after spending like years of healing with therapists and my spiritual path with like meditation, which has been a huge part of it. Also, just the number of books books and resources and stuff that I read in my path to healing. What I wanted to create with my channel was kind of like a synthesis of what I felt would, if it was almost like a channel I'm making for myself, if I could have done that, like 5-6 years ago, basically, to where it's very approachable, the information. So especially for a survivor that's new into it, or just people that are allies and are not themselves dissociative, it's kind of like going back to the basics and trying to explain things in a very uh, clear manner with lots of like illustrations and different things to like like graphs and stuff like that flow charts, things that help you to like really conceptualize like what we're talking about when it comes to what trauma-based dissociation is, what alters in the system are, how to initiate or better communication and therefore functionality in the survivor's life, basically. It's all of these things kind of rolled into one: journaling exercises, visualization exercises, stuff that would allow someone who's really new to dealing with their system and kind of like dealing with their memories and flashbacks and everything, how they can be the most optimistic and like very like productive in healing and everything. Because there's what we'll get into today with like the system structure and stuff, there's a lot of roadblocks that even once someone starts healing, they're going to encounter along the way. And that can really be discouraging, so putting some context to alters, like how to deal with those emotions, how to deal with flashbacks. It's all that basically all that stuff. So I mainly try and gear it towards, because most of our alters are kids, like, and even if you're dealing with alters that see themselves as older, or like maybe splits later on in your life, they've, like 99% of the time have like been traced back, come back to some initial trauma, whether that's like a physical trauma, a sexual trauma, emotional trauma with like abandonment and stuff, which is like a survival attachment thing for kids, and especially the younger that you go. And usually all of this really elaborate system that we're going to talk about, that happens in a survivor's head, they all come back to, regardless of how they present, as traumatized child parts. And so much of progress in my own healing and what I try and convey in my channel is just an understanding of trying to get this stuff basic enough, to describe to a kid, basically, because that's like the parts that are needing to do most of this therapy, and that you're going to be encountering the most when it comes to flashbacks or stuff like that. You're going to be dealing with a traumatized child part, so you have to like learn how to talk to child parts and how to explain how to move forward and connect with like your present life, basically. So sorry that's long-winded, but I'm not as regular on that channel as I would like to be. I try and do stuff as often as possible, but my healing stuff is kind of scattered here and there.
There's no obligation.
Working on it.
You're not obligated. Just like mine. Like I put one out whenever I want. No one is getting on my case if I haven't been 2 weeks or whatever. It's okay. It's like, it's your mind. Your mind fruits out when it does. You know what I mean? So
Exactly.
and I think that's just beautiful. Like your future self talking to your younger self, like as if time didn't exist. I mean, it's amazing because it's really what you needed. And like, and really like some of this stuff is very adult, the blood and the sex and all that crap is like so horrific. How do you talk to a kid through all of that? Like, it really takes an artistic mind. Like your creative artistic mind is perfect. Like they created a perfect weapon. I'm so glad to have you here in your voice, on my show. But they're listening too, but anyway, yeah. So let's talk about before we move on to the internal structure of the victim. Can we talk generally a little bit about the psychology of the abusers for a minute? Because like it is the mothers of darkness, right? And it is like, oh, it's a patriarchy, but then you got these mothers that are really running everything. And if you think about it, like the desires of a man are like dictated by the female. The I guess so, like these pedophilic rapists they themselves are children, and they're abusing everybody else, like being children, the worst kind of child possible. And you gotta anyway, it's really it's tough to get a grasp of this conversation. So okay, so this it is a mother's situation, but the patriarchy wants to dominate the mother and to choke it off and kill it and own it, right? But then it's the mothers who are telling them everything they have inside. So can you talk a little bit about that before we
Yeah. So to clarify, I really don't think the mothers of darkness are running everything. That like
I didn't
if
mean
I
it like
were,
that. Go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, no, I understand. I mean, it's there. We talked a lot about like Dune last time, and on a certain level, they do very much like the Bene Gesserit. I mean, when I say they, do really embody a lot of like what we see in the reality of Mothers of Darkness. There's from like sisterhood above all, and just dealing with like a lot of uh, kind of like dissociation of like violence being bad, you know, and like this like will to control and manipulate, and also be very talented in like occult, sorcery type practices, all of that definitely accurate. But yeah, I would definitely say that the Mothers of Darkness are high on the totem pole, but they're definitely not the top, because at least like I always give the caveat, this is from my experience, from everything that I saw, essentially, that ultimately the people that did have more power were the ones that had been, essentially the people that like wanted the Mothers of Darkness to be programmed, basically. And those are usually going to be, it's kind of patriarchal. If nothing else, it's very like
Like the
it's
owners
very
of the Mothers of Darkness, like whoever
yeah,
created them in the beginning.
yeah. I mean, I would say it's generally men. There are like individual women that do like rise up pretty high and everything, but still it's like they're in my experience, like the people at the top were like vast majority men, basically, just
Right.
because and more of the Mothers of Darkness are have their place in the hierarchy. Like I said,
For
a
the
very
programming, right? To give
yeah,
you the
very,
internal structures.
and because the source of their power and the whole reason I do all this occult stuff anyways, because on a certain level, like I said before, I'm not going to like 100% say that it's like outside entity contact, or if it's just when it comes to this ritual that we talked about, like when I was doing the channeling and everything, if that's just like us, the
The
individual tapping into their like own potential, into like kind of the collective consciousness, the Akashic records, whatever you want to call it, to where it's really just like um, going into that liminal space gives you access to this knowledge, or it's actually what they're saying, which is like genuine, like outside entity involvement. That's something that I still, don't have a good answer on, even with all of my experience with stuff. But regardless, this does generate enough of like an understanding of the things that they're trying to understand, or access to information and everything that they shouldn't have, whether you're dealing with astral projecting, which a lot of people are like known for, more psychic warfare type stuff where people are able to like access other people, or in my case, when it comes to essentially being in like it's like a sage, basically like a channel to where certain rituals, they could ask me questions about things that I would have there's no reason I should have knowledge on, but would be able to give them, reasonable enough answers that they saw the thing as valuable and worth repeating, basically. Um, so I don't know if there was a second part of
Wow. So you could
question.
just be telling them nonsense, and they, because of all of the occult tradition that you've been subjected to, that oh, it had whatever nonsense she's saying is has this all this value. We're gonna write it down. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well,
Like, who knows if it comes from the other
like the
side or if
question.
it just comes from your imagination? But they still, because you've been programmed with all those rituals, your imagination will come up with the correct answer, right? I mean,
Maybe, I mean, to be honest, like the questions that I do remember, like for the most part, I've like dissociated that state, which is why it's hard to say, like on like, because it's like there would be a blackout that I've never been able to access when it came to these channel
right.
events. But ultimately, like I have gotten some like vague, questions and stuff, because for the most part, they would be asking about things that my front self wouldn't understand really what they were. But to be honest, it was mostly like, I want to say like petty shit, so it was kind of like people asking about like how to get one over on like a business rival, or um I don't even know, just mainly like very like worldly. Like to a psychopath, it would be incredibly valuable information because they're always trying to gain power and stuff like that. But for like most people, it's not like they're like, oh, what's the meaning of life? You know what I mean? They're not asking like, really like
No,
important
they're like,
questions.
what does this person eat for breakfast? And then,
Yeah,
that way they
yeah.
can poison it tomorrow.
They just want
Yeah,
to find out how, like, their next merger coming up, how are they going to be able to like dominate the situation, or just stupid crap like that, like very like
I see. And they're
business, a
paying
lot of
you too.
business related stuff.
Like this is a payment situation, right? They hire you to do these.
Not me,
Well,
Gates.
I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, right. They would pay him like he's your pimp or whatever. Gates is
Exactly.
Julius
That's
William
the kind of
Gates.
situation.
Right. So like, but he's loaning you out to these occult orders because you are you're kept in his stable. Like we talked about you, like you're a fine racehorse or dressage horse, you know. Yeah, you can do the fancy stuff, but I mean, but at least what they taught you, you can tell us. It's like, oh my God. So, but anyway, so this guy Gates would be paid by these psychopathic, businessmen who want to know about their next merger, and so they subject you to whatever, and then they is right. I mean, this is a paid
So
thing.
I mean, it is like it was like what I would consider like a regular trafficking gig, but it was like
Weird.
for this kind of stuff, it was once a year at a specific ritual. It's the one that we had in the picture last time with like the black and the green,
Right.
essentially. So because
I
it
can
did
share that.
require, yeah, exactly. So essentially, it's when there would be essentially the induction of like a new baby, a new occult baby to the order. It's like the parents coming to like, to dedicate their baby in like a sacrifice ritual, basically, where another baby would in their stead would be killed. And then it was that blood, like that paid the price of the person that brought their child and the other child that was meant to be sacrificed. Um, they are the ones that had like, it's like by bringing new life into the cult and like dedicating their baby into like being part of this whole like trauma based religion, essentially. That would be the price that they paid to
Oh,
essentially be like have the privilege to ask me questions at the second part of the ritual, where they would mix some of the blood with the water. I'd be kind of dunked in it to the point of drowning, almost similar to like that first ritual under Washington D.C. when I was a toddler. And you know very similar. They would wrap me in a robe and then put the bandage over my eyes. But the people asking the questions were primarily just those like few people that had been part of that ritual. Essentially, it would always be the husband in the situation, and that would be asking me, like I said, questions like, okay, here's your chance. You get to
wow.
ask whatever you want. You know what I mean?
Wow. So
Like,
he
and
had to impregnate his wife to sacrifice. So he had to think like years ahead of what he's going to ask you and then like
maybe, yeah.
dedicate. Wow.
But yeah, most of it I would say was very like worldly, very short term, just kind of like it. Most of what I remember is people asking stuff about how to get ahead in whatever business they were in some way, how to
That
make more
makes
money,
sense.
or gain a little bit more power, or, destroy a rival, all of this stuff, so the dad that had dedicated his kid at the beginning of the ritual, at the end of the ritual, would be able to essentially ask these questions of me, basically. So it was definitely, and then on occasion it would be like the high priest or like a couple of other people that were like pretty much like the top of like the coven druidic type thing that I was dealing with essentially. So very limited the number of people that were asking this, and only once a year basically would there be this elaborate ritual that would precede me being playing that part essentially. So
This is the same
does
time
that make
every
sense?
year. Yes, it does. And it's re-triggering the first one that happened in Washington, D.C.
Exactly.
that we described in the last episode. So they can re-trigger you, and then that pulls up the altar inside that they want, the specific one for that every year.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Okay. So they sex magic is the main. So these are men that are manipulated through the sex magic, right? I
Mhm.
mean,
I mean, not the guys at the top. The thing is, like, the people that are the highest up are by far the most psychopathic, and they are like
not driven by
hands down.
sexual
You know,
desires, right?
yeah. Well, and
Just
they're very
dominating others, right?
they enjoy homosexual relationships. They're going to enjoy like heterosexual relationships. Most of all, they're going to enjoy like bestiality and pedophilia, because really what gets them off the most is not the physical attributes of the thing that they're either consensually or non-consensually having sex with, or raping, essentially. The things that matter the most to them is this feeling of domination and all this stuff. But they are completely aware of like most of the people that they're trying to, honeypot, blackmail, control in some way. So for sure, sexual magic is going to come into play there. Where,
For
like,
the
yes, like
for who
you're going
they're
to
aiming you at, right?
well, exactly, because so they're going to marry off like a black mother to, because she's going to have been that ever since a toddler, is, what I'm explaining, So when she's getting close to, marrying age, they're going to have a plan in life. But you better believe that anyone that she's going to marry and then reproduce with is going to be someone that they would like, consider worthy of reproducing with her, because they're then going to be using that child. But also, it's going to be someone that has, a decent amount of like status and position in just the normal world. It's very reminiscent of, we've talked about Eyes Wide Shut a bunch, but very reminiscent there. So Alice was, slated to be a black mother type persona, where she's going to breeding and then reproducing that like same trauma and stuff on her own child. But she's not married to like some Joe Schmo, she's married to like, a guy he's like a surgeon, right?
Right.
Or
Right.
yeah. So he's married to a guy that has assets, like respect in the world, money, and then also the like
he works for the
someone they would be
richest of the
interested.
rich, Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Someone they would be interested in actually like taking into their, bullshit, elite, psychopathic, kind of world.
And like the Bene Gesserit, they're going to look back through the bloodline of who is trying to mate with who, and like they know, you know what I mean? Like if you look at freaking George W. Bush is, related to King Charles, is related to Brad Pitt, is related to Vlad the Impaler. Like it's ridiculous. But I mean, these things are there's a purpose for, it's driven on, so yes, and these people, they had all these plans for you, that you were going to have 2 kids, and at 35 you were going to switch, and you're going to be one of them, and they had it all planned out, but you kind of shorted out your programming, and they expected you to not survive, and then you did. Oh, let's see if we can use her, and then so they tried to get you again and give you a new programming. And that didn't work. That didn't hold. I'm very glad that you slipped through their fingers again, and you have all of their keys, and you've got all their. It's amazing. Hindsight is usually 2020. Are there any obvious clues that reveal the Mother of Darkness that we as people on the outside can see? Like, oh yeah. Like, now I understand why the Washington Monument is the obelisk, right? Because they got to have that, and that huge space with, really that's what Washington D.C. is made for, the occult space, and then the rest of it is built around that. It makes total sense, and that's why the hierarchies are built the same way. And we're going to talk about the hierarchies, but we're really here mainly, I guess, we want to talk about the internal hierarchies that they place within you. So these Mothers of Darkness, they have the plans, and they also have what is laid into the heads, and like all of them had, like all the heads have this Kabbalah tree, internal structure, and they can all be accessed with the same keys that are held by these Mothers of Darkness. They know how to program the children, and really that's what their true value is to the cult. Is that right?
To a degree. I would say that they have a very specific area that they're good at, like that they're the, like, kind of, in my experience, the only ones of my programmers that dealt at all with any like ritual training, any like anything occult or channeling, psi related type stuff, like 100% them. Gates was never present for this programming. Sometimes I think the only instance really where he was the time that I mentioned you know, the resistance in me during my stay in the kennel when it came to the occult training and being able to do like the execution of, even like an animal. But it was like 5, so this is normal. But yeah, like when it was 5, 6. But in any case, like, uh, at that time, they, I don't won't go over it again, but basically, was put in like a no-win scenario where I wouldn't kill a dog, and then they set it on fire, and then ended up going and having me kill the dog anyway once it was near death, to really kind of cement in my mind the inevitability of death for the things that they've chosen
And
to
it's
be
better to follow their instructions. Right?
Exactly. And that, would I rather be an instrument of death that was merciful, or would I rather contribute to like more pain and suffering on the victim when I didn't have any control of like changing the outcome, basically. So in that instance, like, Gates was with like my occult trainer, Mistress Diane. I've talked to her about her like several times. So, she was Diane. I was, my main archetype for a lot of this stuff, and name was Artemis. So it's pretty much, we were in the same role, but she was like 15,
right,
maybe 20.
The elder training you, right?
Exactly. So every instance where I learned anything in that space of channeling or different stuff, it was always Black mothers. It was always women that were, perpetuating the training, essentially, and and the torture, basically. So yes, they had a huge hand in building all of those parts of the system. Essentially, they were the ones creating the trauma and the trauma bonding, because that is the most important thing when it comes to handling someone and doing, any form of mind control. Is it's not just the torture, but it's also the really reinforcing in the child that, oh, you're part of a group, you're one of them, you normalizing everything you're going through as like training and not trauma, really getting you to like feel loyal and bonded to them, as well as like, this is a big handle on why the cult side of the system stays allied to the cults in Stockholm, to really almost like value their role and feel like chosen or something, and really reinforcing that they're special and all this crap. And then, not to mention like the royalty thing, is that they're very like proud of the fact that they are, not just slaves like everyone else, but like chosen slaves, essentially. So, and that they do have these abilities, that they believe in the occult magical kind of sphere. So it's creating this very like royalty-esque persona, essentially, that's going on, that really, it also it just helps you, the part of your system, to really like identify with the elite, and that everyone else in the world is distant, you're dissociated from, is below you, won't ever understand you, because you're, belong to this other group. Most of the other training, so when it comes to like, the hunter tracker stuff, violence related stuff, even the initial training for the occult stuff, so times where I was like in morgues or in the kennel, in the veterinary portion of it, doing animal or like cadaver dissection there, to like learn, like it was like the like physical knowledge that would be brought into the rituals, essentially. All of this stuff, any sexual training, when it came to the trafficking, hypnosis related stuff, when it came to creating the system structures, all of it was men in my experience. So it was very compartmentalized, like which trainer you would deal with for certain types of programming. Gates was always the violent, human hunting and like dog and wolf style programming. But my dad's friend, I call him my beta trainer, he was 100%, just training sex work type stuff, basically. And, the child pornography related things essentially was 100% him. And a lot of early hypnosis that helped to make, like, kind of set up, make sure that the boundaries were very firm before I did a lot more of the intense violent stuff with Gates later on. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah. So like you were used for those different purposes. You were
Mm-hmm.
these
Different teacher for everything, like
right.
for
And
digital school.
you had different altars inside too. So like
Mm-hmm.
these ones were trained to go hunter trackers, and these ones were trained to go be a whore, and these ones were trained to be occult priestesses, like um it makes total sense.
And I would say in the hierarchy, which we'll get into in the system, but also even in, slaves in the structure, like we said, like the mothers of darkness ultimately are, pretty high. Like this form of
Right.
training is like super specialized, to where there was a reason I was going to them and not, it wasn't the kind of thing that my other handlers could do. But it's also because it's seen as really valuable. This is why this is something they need to like dominate and exploit and perpetuate, is the mothers of darkness stuff, because it gives them an upper hand on, enemies. And especially when we look at other people,
Right.
not
Their
myself,
psychic abilities, right?
other people, exactly. Especially when you look at, that was just my particular thing that I was slated for. I was seen as, capable in. But there's so many, when you look at all the other different psi type abilities that other survivors have talked about, it's like you can really see why it's like a weapon that they want to make sure that they're, that they have to themselves, basically, because it's part of how they've, had and maintained power for this long.
Right. Yeah, you're like another arrow in their quiver, or well, not you, but the Mothers of Darkness are another piece of that forms the structure of the ultimate hierarchy of obedience that is the full structure of the New World Order. The old
Exactly.
world order of Babylon and Nimrod. It's the same shit. Anyway.
Yeah. Different people, same thing. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, same old same. So, okay. So do we want to start with the internal programming? You were talking to us just now about how they layer in this loyalty and pride, and I want to be a cult member. I want to be I am the dressage horse. Of course I'm the best, like, yes, I drink blood. What,
Totally normal.
right, right. And this is like, and they're made, they've been, filling your head with this. And then at 35, you're supposed to like, bip, just switch. And then, and then you wear the robe willingly to program. So tell us about how does the internal structure, you've got some notes, and I know that you have a purpose. You want to really focus on this today. So let's get into that.
Yeah. And I will say on the timeline thing, sorry, this is a last thing that, they can change timelines. So it's like you program in something, but if things don't go the way they plan, then it's like you just switch. You kind of switch these internal clocks, these internal gears, because there are parts that are in charge of this, essentially, in the survivor. So yeah, initially I would have had that switch that was supposed to happen at 35. Initially, I would have had it happen around like 25, 26, like just after the hunter tracker stuff encountered. And basically, and then once I was done being used as the hunter tracker style stuff, then I would be in the position, kind of bureaucratic position of being, the mother of darkness wife to
Queen Regent.
yeah, to a guy from the bloodline that they had determined would be my king, essentially. So
for your
that was
area of the right.
Yeah,
Like
so that was
he's just one of the many, right? Like,
yeah,
okay,
no,
sorry.
it was pretty small territories, that from like what I interpreted, it's
I'm not
like,
saying that you're not important. What I'm saying is
no,
that
no,
like that dude was part of the structure of like the higher. It's not like being a queen regent is like the queen of all. Like
no.
it's like that's your your status given. It's like lieutenant, basically.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. And I knew that's not what you were saying. I was just saying that because it was just to give people like an idea of like what their ultimate plan was, essentially,
Right.
which was that, it was very, top down hierarchy with like, smaller and smaller, like kind of like sections of land of the globe, essentially, and that, they had picked out for all of these very small, smaller areas, kind of more the size of a state or like half a state, from my understanding,
Right.
would be, a chosen
But it's a
man.
feudal situation. And
Exactly.
you would be like the the lord of that regency.
Yeah. So in that scenario, like I would have been more sacrificed at 35. That's the change that would have gone, is that would be, the mother of darkness, like just willing sacrifice to just be like, okay, this is the next step in things, that is just for me to like give up my stuff to the next person or something like that. So,
Crazy.
but yeah, but everything was
Well, you
shut down.
survived. You're older than 35 now. Just want to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, God bless you.
Exactly. And that was like how my timeline had changed after the cruise, the cruise was the reprogramming prior to the Paris ritual. And at that point I was already in my 20s, and they had just, and obviously the New World Order takeover hadn't happened or anything.
Right. They're late. They're very late on their plans. But go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially they gave me a new timeline when they reactivated me, started reprogramming me to where, yeah, I would either stay with my current partner or be with someone else. And that, like, the agenda was that I should have 2 kids by the time I was 35. And that 35 is when the back half, what we're going to be talking about a lot today, is so the cult allied half of the system would, essentially subsume what was normally at the top of our system, which is the day-to-day life, front persona type stuff. It would essentially switch to where the cult side of me would not be the one getting triggered to come out. But mostly I'm in my, day-to-day life system. But instead what would happen is, like, it would be that was me 100% of the time, and what was buried and could be triggered out but they wouldn't want to would be all of, like, the front life kind of persona, basically. So yeah, my front self was supposed to have the kids and really build this, like, good artistic portfolio and reputation at that point, because it was always presented to me that, I would, at 35, the switch would happen. I would divorce or leave, the father of my children. I would move on to who they decided would be my new rich husband. He would put all his, contacts and money into my art career. And then from there, I would essentially be, kind of more, culture creation, celebrity status style artist,
Crazy.
so yeah, that is the switch that was intended to happen. But I had done so many years of healing and moving away from any occult triggering and accessing that when the really intense, like, flashbacks and internal upheaval was going on with all of these parts at this program time, as things would come up as they were timed to, I could see it for what it was, and just deal with these parts the same way I've dealt with all of the other parts that have held the trauma in the past, which is with a lot of compassion and understanding and non-judgment, and could, move them into the light, move them into the present, out of, these trauma programmed roles that they had internalized as their own, all being allies to the cult, and feeling like there was some reason we needed to defend that identity or stay attached to it. It's something that that I was just able to do, and I'm saying that was really incredibly difficult. It was probably the most difficult, like, month of my entire like, 7 years of therapy and healing that I've gone through, was this month, like, leading up to this happening, to be honest, the whole year. But it wasn't until the last month that, I really understood completely what was going on and was able to start dealing with it, basically. And it was like literal hell. It's like flashbacks times a million. It was just constant difficulty, dealing with a lot of emotional pain coming up, a lot of physical pain, because a lot of times you're dealing with, like, body memories of, like, the events that occurred, everything, basically. But had that's part of why I do my channel, is that it's like, if you have context for what you're going through, if you have some guidance, you can really heal a lot more than you would imagine. So yeah, I dealt with, and to be honest, it's just another step of their programming kind of backfiring against them, because what it helped me do was shed a lot of the amnesia that I still had up to that point. It's like there's a lot of things that I've dealt with, a lot less amnesia. It's like every time you're going further in therapy and healing, even if it's not with a therapist, But ultimately, what I ended up with was, way more like way more knowledge, than anything, because it's like all these parts, they're supposed to be very, high clearance, need to know type stuff, is like, it's healing is the process of creating allies out of all of these parts, so it's just another thing that, on the other side of it, just feeling a million times more empowered, dealing with a lot less amnesia about parts of my life that were still huge blanks, and having a lot more understanding of myself and the way I think, and actually feeling way more integrated, which was their intent, was to be more integrated, but on the negative side. So, but just feeling way more integrated than I ever have as just a multiple, someone with DID that has these parts and alters and everything, that it's the biggest beauty of healing, if you've gone through this, is to get to the point where you can heal the parts that have always been so antagonistic in your system, and kind of the ones fueling all of this control that you're really trying to escape.
Right. The ones that are holding you down. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The cult loyal altars within the Philomela. So, okay. So you have an internal structure. These altars, it's not just random. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
So, yeah. So basically, referring to my outline, and I have an outline for today's show just because, like, it's similar to my own episodes, like I said, which I typically try and have like a little outline on, or even something that I'm showing on the side of the screen for people, basically, because there's usually graphs or flow charts, stuff like that. That's important. But ultimately, it's because there are so many facets to what we're talking about. And I get caught up talking, as you can tell, I'm sure. And
That's
then
great.
I come away from it being like, oh, like there was an important point that I missed, basically. And I hate editing. I don't like doing that. So I really try and make sure that I, spend my time really trying to to synthesize and simplify the things that I'm trying to get across to my viewers on that channel. Like I said, to make it very easily understandable by, like, a kid up to an adult. So on this outline, I have like three categories on what to talk about. It's not necessarily important which one we start with. So I'll just give people like an idea of, what that is, especially if they're just listening. And that's,
Yeah, we have a lot of just listeners also, please.
exactly. Exactly. So the three kind of areas that I figured are good subjects to talk about, to give like a complete picture of what the internal programmed reality is for a slave, is scripts. So a script would be a template, usually a narrative template that has been created prior to a trauma event by the abusers, to essentially like reinforce a certain narrative, or like characters or roles or just visualizations that they want uh the victim to be having during like the dissociation and the trauma and everything. So that would be like movies and things that have been
Wizard of
created in
Oz.
books. Yes, that's when you hear about the Alice programming, Wizard of Oz programming, these kinds of things.
Alice in Wonderland, right? That's the other one, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And
The Alice.
the one Over the Rainbow that
And even
yeah.
like children's nursery rhymes, like
Right.
different straightforward stuff like this, basically can be
Right. Most of the
used.
children's nursery rhymes are made for that purpose, are they not? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple nursery rhymes that factored into my own programming, So,
right.
um, yeah, so really, yeah, like a script is like a template, usually in media or something, that they create, and we can go more into that. Structure would be essentially like the microcosm and macrocosm of the survivor's internal world. So usually they're going to be really vast if you're dealing with ritual abuse and mind control. They've created tons of splits, tons of altars, lots of different skill sets, etc. And they want to make sure that the handler, not the survivor, the handler has access to all of these things. And a lot of how they do that is they build internal worlds that are very based off of geometric structures or grids. A lot of different
Kabbalah tree.
The Kabbalah tree factors in energy centers on the body. There's a lot of different things that factor into the overall structure of it. So that would be like the macrocosm of like the structure that all of the parts take. But then within that, you're going to have parts living in their own internal worlds. Usually there's multiple if you're dealing with this kind of level of splitting. And it's a way to like organize this vast number of parts, create some like rhyme and reason, to the chaos of, a fractured mind, and be very like 100% familiar to the programmer, so that it's not just like a child's mind just like on a whim, imagining all this different stuff. Like they want to know exactly what the internal structure is, so they know how to create codes, triggers, accessing of the exact part that they want to pull out, when they want to, even if they're not there when you're dealing with time stuff, basically. And then the hierarchy. So the hierarchy is all about like what, if you were looking at this like a military system, like what altars have, the most power in the system, the most knowledge of the system structure, and are really the ones that are like aiding the abusers, the external abusers internally, by being internal abusers that really perpetuate the abuse, but also reinforce like obeying the structure, that they've put into place for you, basically, all the way down to the bottom of the totem pole type parts, which would be the ones that have the least knowledge, and therefore the least like of their internal structure, and therefore like the least power in the system to like, really direct what's going on in the survivor. So
right, to have the control of the hierarchy of who is controlling the vehicle of your body.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So the ones that are loyal to the cult are the ones that are most easily get to hold on to the steering wheel.
Yes.
And you're saying, I see.
Yeah. And I appreciate using that metaphor, because that is definitely one I use a lot in my channel when I'm trying to really describe like what it means to
little
be.
Kids get that too. They're driven around.
Yeah.
Right? Yes.
The body is a car, and we're talking about like who's in the driver's seat, who's in the passenger seat, who's in the back
There's
seat.
multiple seats.
Yeah, and there's a trailer too half the time, or a train is like I've talked about, that has a whole bunch of other parts in it that aren't even in the car, in the consciousness, in the body, affecting it.
And they
at
can
all.
be split infinitely. I mean, it's just,
because you're dealing with
imagination.
Yeah, it's very powerful, especially when you deal with a child's imagination. That's for sure.
Right. And you have to pick the most imaginative children to do this to. We already spoke about that before. So your imaginative qualities and your artistic abilities are necessary for this type of internal programming, right? The scripts and the structure,
the 3 components,
and the hierarchy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And these things are visible here for the listeners that choose to watch. The 3 are scripts, structure, and hierarchy. And the scripts are, you explained, are like Wizard of Oz. That's, you can take it off the shelf. That's a script. Anybody that wants to learn to be a programmer can just learn those scripts and like whatever. I don't know. Maybe not anybody. But anyway, but it's easy for all programmers to pick you up and use you. Just like everybody knows how to use a gun, you pick it up, you pull the trigger, right? That's how it's operated. So the same with you, like they use scripts so that all the handlers can kind of wield in a general way your parts, right? That way they can all get a grip of them because of the scripts. Kind of, it's easy for them to find all of the parts. It creates order out of the chaos, you said.
So partially true, I would say.
Please
Like,
continue.
yeah, no, that's fine. Like this, it's you got it part way.
Okay,
So
I'm trying.
sorry. No, it was really good. Like everything you described, except for like them wanting like every other handler to be able to do it, like on
All
a
right.
certain level.
Only the specific
So
ones.
there are certain templates that are pretty ubiquitous, you know what I mean? Like Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland type of programming, but it's in my experience, very individualized to the preferences of the handler. So it's more about what
Oh,
what they themselves are going to be able to, what template they like, that has like the different elements that they're interested in, that they're going to know and be able to use. Yes, they can definitely share that if they choose to with like other with
if they're gonna loan you
other
out,
hand.
like what Gates did.
Exactly. They'll share triggers, they'll share, different things like that for sure. Um but it's very like it's certain groups that do the same thing, but it's really varies a ton when you're looking at like survivors as a whole, basically. So like if it was all the Jesuit slaves to a degree are going to have the same base programming, all the Druidic slaves are going to have the same base programming, but you'll have variation depending on the handler's preferences and then what the actual like main roles are of the slave, essentially. So um, that's a lot of like where like the scripts come in, is that the child is their mind is going to be splitting from the trauma you're putting them through. That's the whole point they're doing it. So they want to make sure to kind of like create, the set and setting, like they want to be able to create
Yeah.
essentially the world, like the identity these altars are going to take, rather than just leaving it up to the kid, and a lot of that they want to understand. So if they're basing your parts off of a parts in like a movie or a book or something like that, then they're that part they're creating, they're going to create with like the same motivations as that character, which is something you can literally pick up and read in a book. But because you have that internalized part identifying with it to the umpteenth degree, because you're dealing with trauma, but in my experience also like the most intense um, internalizing of scripts, essentially, and kind of narratives that you were modeling your system after, and identities. It was um, always like in highly elaborate scenarios that would really increase the believability. But it was also a lot of times in my experience, like accompanied by, probably small doses of hallucinogens and stuff like that, to where there's like an increased blurring of like, what is reality? Like, what am I? So you're going to have the
Right.
dissociative split, feeling very, not knowing your identity and feeling very suggestible and everything after you've gone through enough trauma to create a new split. Then now they're going to be like, well, this is who you are, this is what you think, this is the story arc that you are a part of, and that part really identifies with it.
So, like the Labyrinth movie, the the girl, she dreams of this goblin king or whatever, but then at the end you see like all the stuff is on the walls, like it's all there, like all the characters are like, on the posters, or like,
Mhm.
the stuffed animal or whatever is, those are all integrated parts of the internal structure. So like we see as like, oh yeah, she was just dreaming of her teddy bear and her poster, and oh, it's just a dream of. To us watching Labyrinth, it's like, oh yeah, she was just dreaming because the set and setting.
Mm-hmm.
So it is influenced. And much like people who take hallucinogens and go to dead shows or whatever, there are people are more suggestible, and there are people with desires and intentions, and they try to use the drugs to make people off their balance and make them victims to whatever they desire. Like, I mean, even at that level we see it, so I'm sure it's layered in with these child programming worlds. Of course, LSD and scopolamine and all of these other, huge drugs are used in specific ways in specific dosages for little babies to break their minds in specific ways that the mothers of darkness have, scripts, and they want you to break in a specific way, right? So this is how the script works. This is how you're supposed to break. But I mean, really, the set and setting of your entire imaginary world, we can see that in the Labyrinth, and that film we know is programming like that. It's like MK Ultra all the way. So if that helps with your description.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, taking a more modern example than Wizard of Oz, The Labyrinth is a great example of like a programming script. You have a young girl. It's kind of normalized that there's like possibly this like romantic attraction, to this like older man who, his outfit is very similar to like the one that Gates was riding,
Oh
like
my God.
riding in on the white horse on, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like the stereotypical like romance novel kind of look, the long hair and just
Crazy. And David
tights
Bowie
and
is one of them too.
poofy.
Like he was born like at a specific date and was programmed, never mind. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. That is a common thing, is where it seems like they use people that have the traits, you know, playing the roles that they actually are on screen to a degree,
Right.
Um, so, you deal with princess programming, so that's like her, that's a lot of what goes into the loyalty, and like cult allied alters the royalty ones, is this idea of like, being a princess, you will literally, for a programming event with that, you will literally be treated like a princess, like
Right.
you will be traumatized. And then after the trauma comes like a love bombing or like trauma bonding experience, of like praise or good experience with the handler, essentially. Well, with princess programming, you would be, traumatized, and then you would literally be, praised and then treated, lavish with attention and, goodies, wealth, whatever, play acting, like you're a princess, and, having servants or different stuff that reinforces like, okay, this is the identity that I want, not like the girl that just got raped like, 10 minutes ago,
Yeah.
that felt like they were powerless. Like, this is the real identity that I'm interested in, basically, is that, oh, like maybe that thing I just went through like was something I wanted, and maybe it's the Stockholm syndrome stuff where
Wow.
they, you can't get away from your abuser, and you're getting this good treatment now, so now you're just gonna like, kind of try and forget, that's the dissociate the bad stuff, and then you'll have this new part that's there to push away that other identity, push away the trauma, and only kind of identifies with
So that's
the
the
positive
hierarchies.
experience. Yes, yeah. That's like a perfect illustration of like where you would have different parts on the hierarchy. So the pain holding part that dealt with the, 10-minute ago rape, basically would be very low on the totem pole of a hierarchy, basically. Like things like that are like the emotional fuel for the hierarchy part that comes out of it. But ultimately, it's the part that's like pushed away into, for a lot of survivors, this would be getting into structure. For a lot of survivors, they have like dungeons, pits, graveyards, this kind of thing where
Lake of
the
fire in the Bible, right?
so very hell-like a lot of times, but essentially the pain holding parts are pushed down into the subconscious, and the only reason they get pulled out is because they don't want these parts to re-meet. Usually, the part that is just willing to identify with all the good stuff, and really chooses to push away the other one. So the only times these parts get pulled up is because as part of like punishment programming, where essentially you would be having um, hierarchy parts that are from behind the scenes, the cult allied parts from behind the scenes that are watching the day-to-day life of the survivor. And if there are things, or even the cult life of the survivor, but if they start doing something to stray away from what they're supposed to be doing according to the handlers, or starting to remember or like search internally for answers to things, what you'll experience is like these trauma parts that have been kind of stuffed away into this holding area, where you can squish all that emotional and physical pain dissociated away, but they can choose to they have these things filed, so they can choose to, okay, you start remembering something, you start talking about something, we're going to pull up this part that has this memory, and you're going to experience a lot of emotional and physical pain, basically, in response, to kind of like, whip you back into shape, into, either distracting you or really just like, especially if you're getting momentum with healing, this stuff will constantly come up because you're straying into areas you're not supposed to in your system and in your memory. And there's going to be things that those parts that want to keep the structure intact, that they're going to implement, that the abusers have programmed into them, like knowledge of like, okay, you're going to pull up this trauma incident, this one, to throw the survivor off their game, like I said, and like ultimately just punish
Suicide
them
programming
physically. Yes, that would be exactly what we're talking about. That's like the kind of like the ultimate, the worst kind of aspect of things is like would be the programming. Sometimes it's called omega programming, where you have parts that are literally like pulled up for the survivor to kill themselves. And that is incredibly common to encounter when you start straying into like any new memory kind of like zone, basically, so or yeah, I mean, or the like another punishment thing is like early on, like talking out and everything. It's like I had an early experience of being programmed to to confess to Jesus, basically, that I had been just traumatized. This was something that happened in the core split event. You just get essentially like raped, and you're being held captive, and Jesus comes in and you're just like telling him everything, basically, because you're a kid and you're under the influence of stuff and you've dealt with all of this like trauma.
And he
like
asks you, and he acts compassionate, right?
he acts compassionate initially, but
At
then
first, yeah.
yeah, and then rapes you with a crucifix to basically like create this memory that then from then on was always like there to like, if I started talking about the stuff that I went through, whether I'm dealing with therapy, or was just telling just anyone, any outsider, basically, my mom, my husband, my therapist, initially on podcasts and stuff like that too. It's like it's like you afterwards deal with the physical feeling of like a post rape, basically, because you have this part that's programmed to see, okay, is she stepping out of line? If so, this is the memory we're going to pull up, because that's what it convinced me of, was like that he would be like, you're lying, you're telling lies, even though I was being truthful when I was talking to this fake Jesus about what I had just gone through. the reaction was that, I was having this like ultimate figure, you know what I mean, telling me that I'm a liar, that I shouldn't tell stories and I shouldn't talk about these things, and this is the consequence for girls that talk about shit they shouldn't, you know what I mean? So it's a kind of graphic illustration of it, but this is, when you see the level of like evil, but also intelligence that goes into this kind of stuff to really, solidify their ability to do this, and then to also trust that, okay, like the survivor is going to have so many obstacles to really healing, that's how they really try and ensure the control and the silence and everything, it's with these very intense shock and awe moments. And that would be another case of being, kind of like a script type thing. This is a scenario that was come up with to create these different, emotions and beliefs in the survivor that I guarantee you I wasn't the only one that was subjected to. It was probably something that they figure out works, and then they just, they rinse and repeat because they're ultimately not that creative a lot of times when it comes to psychopaths, and really they feel like they find something that works, they stick with it. I think that's why, the Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland scripts, Peter Pan program, different things like this are stuck around for so long, that because it's like they're like, it works, it's a template that works, it touches on the archetypes we want, those story arcs that we want. Oh yeah, because that's the other thing with scripts, is a lot of times these movies are edited too, so you're not seeing the full, because most movies have an overall positive message a lot of times, moral of the story stuff that
Sometimes.
comes in. Yeah, but especially if you're looking maybe recent, the past decade isn't like the best example, things have gotten weirder and weirder. But in
It's
general,
bad.
like, yeah, in general, things were, more simplistic, about right, wrong, and good always winning, and all this stuff. So a lot of times the survivor will be exposed to these things, but they will be edited so that you're only seeing the parts that make you come to the conclusions that they want. They're not going to just have you watch the whole movie and enjoy it, like it's a very specific purpose of it, so does that make sense? Are there any questions
Yes,
in the script area?
it does. And that makes sense why they're raping children so hard, because that is what that they're raping they're raping that kid for the rest of his life or her life. And
Yeah.
it's like that rape has to stick in there. So that's why it's so extremely, like, that's why it's so totally brutal. And it has to be that way. I mean,
And a lot of times why you have people in costumes or, it during rituals and stuff is like, yes, that is one thing that they enjoy, for one, and for two, they feel like has sort of occult power that's generating. But for three, it is the stuff, the particular things they're wearing, like robes, masks, it's like this stuff.
ermine fur, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, because to make things ultra traumatizing, they're going to make things as scary as possible for the kid, essentially. So,
Right.
and these are all things, that are going to take an already traumatizing experience and kind of bring it to the next level, and also make it more believable, the power that they're trying to convince them that they have, essentially.
So it has to be it has to be believed by the future self of the victim. They have to rape it so hard that the future victim, like, that rape has to stay forever in like a timeless space,
Hmm.
and it's always there, accessible, and like, so this in the mind is the timeless space, and they can have this. Doesn't matter, you're a child, you're an adult, they're like abusing the adult. They don't even know what you did in the future, but they hate you, and they're doing that to the little child who's innocent. but they're like, we want you to follow orders so much, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this emotional fuel, like this, the pain is the fuel. So that's why it's got to be that high, because it's got to gas up the rest of your life. They're going to be draining on that emotional thing, but that rest of your life is going to, that's eternity, is then it's like it's always there.
Yeah.
Once it happens, it's always there.
One of the best things I've read is called Chainless Slaves on Deprogram Wiki. And that title says it all. Chainless slaves. You know, what you're trying to do is, the whole point of any of this, of like mind control stuff and slaves, is they want people that can be their slaves and do their will even when they're not around, basically, you know, that, and they know that they're not always going to be around unless they're keeping you captive, which they're not. But the whole point of everything they're doing is to create fractured fractured people that can,
Bots.
that can obey everything they want to a T, especially we said different timing throughout the years of like the survivor's life without them being around, even at all. It does help, if you also have handlers around, which they typically do, that can, enable switches, keep an eye on programming being attacked and stuff like that. But for the most part, all of that stuff is done by the survivor themselves. Like, even if I was looking at like this last year and all the stuff I had to deal with, the programmed occult parts wanting to like come out and take over, basically. It's fucked up shit to laugh about, but I don't even.
You
Like,
survived, though. I mean,
yeah,
we have this
exactly.
gallows humor.
I know, and to be honest, that's been a lot of staying positive through all of the healing. Has been on a certain level. It's a programmed part, that was there to deal with, was always there to deal with the public in my day-to-day life, but especially later on in like the occult hierarchy. But that is on a certain level the persona that they programmed, was someone that was very lighthearted and didn't take anything too seriously. It was just but it is also still a part of me, and a part of me that I value, because if I didn't have that part of myself, I wouldn't be here talking with you today. I wouldn't have done all these different interviews or had the confidence, to start sharing my knowledge with other survivors, my experience at all, if I didn't have this part that was willing to just like be like, yeah, I'm talking to like a bunch of strangers about like the most crazy stuff, and
The
so
truth
it,
is
it
what you're
is,
talking
yeah.
about. It's crazy, but it's the truth.
Well, exactly, but it is like it's so dark and disgusting and just like literally the worst shit in humanity, But on a certain level, I just have to be like, this is who I am. I've had detractors on the internet that are like, she sounds like a rich valley girl or some shit. Like, obviously, she's just doing this for attention. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. Like,
Who
this is the
wants
part
that
of me,
kind of attention?
right? I'm like, but this is
Crazy.
the part of me that's able to share with you this stuff. If you
Yes.
guys want me to record a podcast when I'm like in the middle of a flashback and like a crying mess, like, sure, but you're not going to be able to understand anything I'm saying.
Right. Right. The way that you can bring it back, you can have the fugue state and bring it back to conscious like words later. Like this the fact that, so this 35 thing, this happened recently.
Yeah, so I'm gonna be 37 next month. So,
Wow. So it kind of
yeah. So
times with COVID.
what was that?
Kind of times lines up with COVID.
No, no, it
No?
was probably like 2023.
23. Okay. So
Yeah.
like okay. All right. So yeah, we're 25
So,
already now.
oh
Holy
wait,
crap.
no, because so it was when I was 35, my 36th birthday. Sorry, getting confused there. But yeah,
Okay.
so it was my 36th birthday. So, which was actually last year's birthday.
Okay.
So that was like
Okay.
the time leading up to, I'm about to be 37 now in like a month, and like So basically, about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, maybe just slightly longer, was when I dealt with like this, very intense time of my life. That whole year was intense because there was a lot of internal things happening. Um, but also yeah, it was
You
basically
were a
that
guest on our
period.
show during
Yeah,
that time.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, it's true, and that's part of why, I'm working on putting all my stuff into like writing now and all this, part of why I haven't done as many episodes, is because as much understanding as I had before when I was talking about stuff, it's like this past year, it's like my experience healing gains momentum, basically. Like
Yay.
um,
Wonderful.
and yeah, so lucky me, not lucky abusers, that I was able to like transition through that last birthday. And like I said, it's like I came out of it much uh you know stronger, more, kind of like whole and integrated and stuff in parts, because um when you're dealing with this like kind of system structure like I have, which has, like is use what most people would see as like a single system, but I have like basically four of them kind of layered on, with like each one kind of having different um purpose, essentially, for housing specific parts, and a very like distinct inner world for each one, that uh it's probably like the first battle for the survivor to really be able to dialogue with parts, and then you start getting more system knowledge of like what you're dealing with, basically. But a lot of times, just because you have the knowledge of what you're dealing with, it's completely different than having actually gone through the steps of like healing all these different parts. You can have some ideas of what parts you're dealing with and why they're causing the issues in your life that they are, amnesia that they're holding back and everything like that. But it's like something completely different to actually um, them being in dialogue with you, and not like you can know that they're there and playing their roles,
Instead of
but
fighting
it
you,
can
they're
still
in
be,
dialogue, right?
yeah, exactly. But they can still be playing their roles, but they're there. And then the next step is that, yeah, that you're dialoguing and healing with these parts, to really just be like, hey, you were a kid. This is all the crap that you went through. And this is why you believe you are what you are. But in reality, this is our life, and you don't have to do that anymore. And that's kind of coming back to what started this, was just that,
Yes.
it's a way to create in the mind of the program slave, like a control system that will outlive the abusers, and will continue to do what's supposed to, because those parts are very, that's the only identity they know, essentially. So it takes a lot of healing to be able to like really introduce all those parts that went through all of this really intense stuff, that that they were a kid, they didn't have any control over it, and that they're an adult now, and not in the clutches of, a lot of these parts think that their abuser is just next door or something, very
Right.
close in
Right.
proximity. So getting them to understand that's not the case is a huge part of it.
Even in the afterlife, they can, they are afraid of like, oh, they're watching, like spiritually or whatever. Like, okay. So, like, these loyal parts they have the emotional fuel to abuse you, and when internally, when you're trying to speak or learn about yourself. But if you take away that emotional feel, if you take away the power of the emotions, maybe tell us about, how does this work? Like, how do you take the power away from these memories that are trying to trigger you? Uh, do you heal the first emotional thing, and then that takes away the fuel for their? Um,
Yeah. So it's like, convincing a child soldier to like lay down their weapon. You know what I mean? It's like a, um, it's, you're dealing with like part with a lot of PTSD. And the first step really is in addressing that you have the part crying out for help, basically, and, dealing with these flashbacks and everything. So the first thing is really just, starting the dialogue, because the thing is like we're dealing with different personalities. So it can sound crazy like you're talking to yourself, but the perception of the person with DID is that it's two completely separate people that are having a conversation, even though it's all happening in your own head. So the first thing is always going to be to like acknowledging the pain there. You know what I mean? The emotional upset that's been bleeding through into your life. And then to kind of take steps to really be like, you are part of a system essentially. And that this is, doing stuff even in a mirror to just be like, this is what we look like now. It's like not a child. I think you're muted.
You're just telling them information. You just use information, and that's your weapon to disarm them.
Yeah,
The
well,
internal parts.
so to get a child soldier to lay down their weapon, you would need to have them feel safe first. So it is addressing the emotions on a certain level. You have to you have to basically be like, hey, the war is over. Like, I know you're stuck in that place. People can picture, soldier PTSD.
Kids like to be stuck. They like to be stuck. I can't get my kid to think about something else. He's like, meh,
Exactly.
They're very good at that. They're very, yeah, sorry.
No, it's true. That's like what I'm saying, that it's like, picture a soldier that's like come from like, everyone can picture this. It's like something they've seen a lot in movies or have experience with in their own life. It's like an adult that's been in a very intense situation, comes away, usually for like an extended period of time. They come home with PTSD, meaning that their brain is, even though they're in a safe place, logically, like their brain is stuck in the war still, is dealing with all of the grief of losing people, is dealing with all of like the pain of maybe getting injured, is dealing with like the feeling of always having to like look around every corner, expecting, people to be coming after them and like shooting them. Yeah, helplessness, powerless to get out of a situation that they're in. You know what I mean? That it's just something they're committed to, and dealing with the fear of death constantly. All of this stuff that people can understand in like a military soldier. Like, this is what every survivor's part is dealing with, but it was a kid instead, so way less context to like bring to the situation, that war zone you were in. Like, you were a child, so you had like way less context on like, hey, like, this is a temporary situation, it will be over one day. It's basically your whole reality. So trying to take that part and really like be like, hey, the war is over. I understand you have to validate the feelings. You can't just be like, we're not there anymore. Like, just shut the fuck up. You know what I mean? And just get over it and stop making me like cry every 5 minutes, or like visualize, some like horrible thing, like someone being killed in front of us or something like that. You can't just be like, okay, like, we're adults now, no time for this. That does not get you anywhere with dealing with this kind of
The
stuff.
emotions are real and they're timeless. Yeah. They're always there. Right.
They're valid for what you went through, but so that's the different aspects you have to deal with when you're healing these parts 100%, is that when you're initially dealing with them and dealing with the flashbacks, dealing with like feeling like you're there and everything, once you're a certain way along in healing, it'll kind of become more natural and more to start having this bleed through that comes through prior to like really intense flashbacks of like the emotional feelings that you were feeling: abandonment, terror, disgust, whatever it is. You'll be dealing with body memories, so that's like literal physical sensations that you were feeling at the time. And then you can be just it's a lot of like kind of like merging of lenses basically between who you were then and who you are now. And when you get further along in healing, you can really start to like recognize like, oh, like the emotions I'm feeling are not appropriate to these situations I'm dealing with in my adult life, you know. And a lot of times that will be bleed through from you know, a flashback, you know. And then the flashback itself is full on, you know, photographic memory, you know, a lot of times of what was going on. For me, especially certain dissociation involved like somewhat out of body experience, you know, to where you're able to, you know, a flashback feels like you're reliving the thing all over again in, you know, intense detail and with all the feelings that come with it, physical
Right.
and emotional.
Ab reactions. Right.
Yes, yes, exactly. So you have to validate all of that kind of stuff, but you also have to like, you know, it's kind of like a dance that you have to do. It's like a you have to allow the child part to get their feelings out and everything like that, but then you have to do something with it. You can't stay stuck in that. Like that is what a lot of the punishment programming is that it's like these flashbacks but weaponized. So they're gonna come up and then it's gonna keep you stuck in this very depressed, very low place, you know, that you just like a hole you can't get out of. Um so
And you do it
that
to yourself. Like I recognize that in myself, and I'm not abused like you. Like, like I, you
yeah,
know, like, wow.
it's normal
Yeah.
human
To
psychology, but
like
it's just weaponized.
yeah, you deserve it, and like, oh, like, anyway.
So like that's like negative self-talk, you know, which is normal
Yes,
for like for anyone to have.
I
So
hope
it's just
so. I
like
hope
make sure
it's
you're
normal.
having
I'm,
well it is. I
whatever.
mean
Right, right, right.
I
I'm
mean it
sorry.
is like I'm trying to remember the name of the guy that wrote What to Say When You Talk to Yourself, but you know, great book. So yeah, self-talk, negative self-talk is like insanely normal. It's like something that everyone has. Um, when it's, you know, in the DID system though, most of the time that voice is going to be different than your own, and it's a lot of times going to be like coming from like multiple multiple angles, you know what I mean? So because a lot of it is based off of, you know, these scripts like internalized like villains or the villains in your own life, your abusers that have been internalized in the system essentially and
Right.
have become
Mirrored lookalikes of them living in your mind, right?
that are there
Keeping
to
the
say all the things
wow.
to keep you in line. So that's what a lot of why I tell people is like, you know, you might not always be dealing with like a scared, hurt part when you're dealing with flashbacks. Sometimes you're dealing with, you know, these parts, you know, the ones that are seen as persecutors, introjects, you know, are there to intentionally be the villains of the system. And because of that, they behave like that. So initial interactions are always going to be very, you know, probably the most off-putting and intense and stuff like that. And there will be a lot of sabotaging on the parts of those parts, you know, to really undermine the healing process, essentially. But ultimately, it's like dealing with a bully on a program on a playground, basically. That it's like you have to be the adult in the situation, essentially, and be like, okay, I know all of these things you're throwing at me. I know this way that you're presenting, but I know underneath it all is like a hurt kid. So you don't react with fear. You know, a lot of times when you are dealing with programming being intact, that is the normal reaction, is for those parts to be very powerful, to be bullying other parts in the system who are all based off of kids, and you know, into doing what they want and into submitting to like the wills of the abusers or the wills of those parts themselves, because they're, you know, enacting those, you know, parameters in behavior on the system. So uh yeah, is there any is that making sense, I guess?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Like the that's part of the hierarchy of our notes is the internal abuser, and the internal abuser uses that initial raped by Jesus memory as emotional fuel and that's going to bleed over before you get the memory. You're going to feel this feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've learned to recognize that and to anticipate what is coming. And then you confront that child within you, say, hey, you don't have to do this. And I love you. You're me, you know, and then they can be like, oh, I love you too. And
Yeah,
then,
that's all
yeah,
they really want most of the time, is just like they never wanted to be in the situation they were on. They never wanted the mantle of power that was given to them, these horrible roles, like ultimately
they
they
don't want
were,
to abuse you inside. Like they don't want to
yeah,
be the abuser even.
no, no. The only reason they're doing that is because it felt like the only thing they could do to get some love and safety from their handlers. And
Right.
that was their source of that kind of stuff. So once they realized that the handlers aren't around and that ultimately they're working against themselves as opposed to for it, that's kind of like the big steps, especially for the when you're dealing with the hierarchy, the cult allied parts, is that you really have to, acknowledge kind of the burden that they've carried, that they had to internalize that identity and all this stuff, and really making you recognize like you don't get what you want, which is love and acceptance and peace, by doing what the abusers want, which what we want as a system, what we choose to do, which is like something positive and productive and healing oriented in our lives. And a lot of this really is about journaling. That's what I constantly come back to in my channel, and my testimony and everything, is that it came from Kathy O'Brien and her work with Mark Phillips. Is some neuroscience into this stuff, to where you it's like a simple step that you can do to bring the past information into the present and bring the emotional like information, because it's all stuck on the emotional kind of side of your brain, and you need to bring it to the logical side of your brain. And part of doing this is literally picking up the pen, writing on paper. It's like it creates this shift of that information from just being on repeat, in your head like a movie playing over and over, to instead being something that you've externalized on paper. and
That's
and
why
it
we do
just
it in school, right?
exactly, yeah, having to put it into words and put it on paper like literally moves that information to the logic side of your brain, to where that part of your brain can recognize, okay, this is my identity, this is who I am safe to a degree because I'm here and able to just sit and journal about these experiences. And it really like builds trust with the part, essentially, to where
The core
they're willing
self
to
again.
put down that gun.
Yeah. They
Exactly.
trust yourself. They trust themselves, and they recognize, oh, I'm
Hmm.
not separate anymore. Or
Yeah.
can
And
choose to recognize that, I guess.
yes. And this is part of why I say like healing gains momentum, is for one, you get better and better at recognizing the things that you're dealing with before they start really sabotaging your mental state and your life and behaviors and stuff. Like you can become much more functional as an individual, and more grounded. But also because like as you heal parts and more intensely traumatized parts or cult allied parts, then as you encounter new ones that are there to, I mean, they're not new, they've been with you for a
They've been
long time.
programmed in, right?
Exactly, but they haven't chosen to present
Figured out
themselves to
yet.
the conscious, yeah, to your conscious mind. Sometimes they get forced to through triggering and stuff like that, but most of the time, they're going to try and stay, they're stuck in their own world as hidden as possible. So the more parts that you do heal and you're like, okay, I was able to work through the shame of being trafficked, I was able to work through, the shame and horror of being used in rituals and stuff like that, that each part you're able to bring into the present and to kind of like integrate into the conscious part of your system, um, for subsequent parts, you know, they've seen this happen over and over. So it's easier and easier for you to deal with that kind of trust aspect, because they're like, okay, like she was able to deal with this information, which is horrible and everything, and to, like, you know, bring context to it. Well, like maybe like my fucked up situation is something I can actually come to her with, you know. And that's always the case with the, you know, the higher up the parts are in the hierarchy, the more likely they are to have gone through the things that would be most most what's the word, cognitive dissonance, you know. So the things that would be the most difficult for your front self to accept that you have gone through or participated in or forced to participate in, you know, cannibalism and the ritual type stuff and everything, like that is something that part of the reason it's dissociated is because part of you is trying to say, I don't want to look at that. I don't want to accept that that's part of me. And then this part of you is like, I don't want to tell them that. You know, like
Right.
I don't want to
Whoa.
have them look at me the way the way I know they're going to look at me, just with like disgust and, you know, shame and all this stuff. So it's part of what keeps those, you know, that intense hierarchy in the system, you know, is that those cult allied parts don't want to be seen, you know. On a certain level, your front self doesn't want to see like what they know, because it
That's
is
why the
so intense. That's why
cannibalism,
you've
that's why the
dissociated, you know.
bestiality, that's why cannibalism, that's why the bestiality, because it has to be so bad that you'll block it away so
Yeah,
hard. I mean, this episode is making so much
weaponized shame.
sense. Like, I mean, the reason, like, I'm always like, why do they gotta rape them so bad? Like, oh, now I know. Like, thank you. Okay.
And they enjoy it. Like that is
Well,
the other
that
aspect
too.
of it. But
Yeah.
there's also like a complete willingness there on their part to do this kind of stuff. It's not like, oh, I wish I didn't have to rape them so bad. You know what I mean? Like,
Sure.
so on their part, they are more than happy to oblige what
Obviously.
programming requires to create these kind of splits. Yeah.
So it all feeds itself and it goes for generations and generations. And what the mothers of darkness have programmed into your future life and are like hidden, that are going to pop up when you're older, they've hidden stuff into our future generations. They're
Hmm.
trying to make stuff bubble out.
Exactly.
And that's Bene Gesserit right there. I mean, holy crap. Like that's Dune. Like Frank Herbert really knew what he was talking about. It's crazy. So
Exactly.
so this okay, well, let's get back to your notes here. We have
I know. I had
so
like had this structure where like
it's
just
it's great. Like the gatekeepers, self-destruct punishment, we did that, and the demonized parts, we didn't really. I mean, we kind of talked about the demonized stuff in our past episodes.
mhm.
Um,
That's usually
they
be like the
please
head of
go
the
ahead,
hierarchy.
talk about it for. Please talk
Yeah,
about
no,
that
no.
for a minute.
All I was gonna say is that's definitely gonna be like the head of the hierarchy. Like even a lot of like deprogramming stuff or other survivors have talked about how, you know, there's almost like this demonic energy that's able to create like and keep intact this very elaborate system. And like I've mentioned many times before, I still come down on the side that I'm like, if it's actual entity involvement or it's literally just like a part of you that has complete belief that they've consented to playing this part in this system, it does not matter, because ultimately it has the same effect. You know, it's the outcome is the same, and essentially you're going to have the most cognitive distance, the most dissociated parts from your actual identity are going to be the highest in the hierarchy. So, you know, demonic and like robotic type parts are always going to be, you know, because some systems are not modeled after, you know, deities and demons and stuff. This goes back to programmers' preferences and everything. You could literally just be dealing with people that have what have been internalized as like robots or AI systems or stuff like that. Basically, if they programmer, coming back to the scripts, if the programmer has wanted something like more space related or something, like we're dealing with Star Wars and Star Trek and that kind of stuff, you definitely, and the alien narrative, basically,
right.
Not anything that's involved in my system, but something, but other people's systems that is modeled after that doesn't have this have this more medieval druidic castle type structures that we deal with. And then you have other people that have gods or nature spirits that are the ones that are seen as like the most powerful in the system. You'd be dealing with like tree of life and tree of death type programming with that, basically, where the overall structure of the system would be more like a like a mirrored tree kind of structure,
yes,
basically,
the
with
Kabbalah
like
tree.
Yeah, so like a tree of life on the front, which would be dealing with the day-to-day life, and then the tree of death, which would be essentially dealing with all of the occult altars. So these are different ways to like model the overall structure of the slaves system, and the hierarchy, like what they'll be identified with is going to be, what fits with that particular script and structure that they've.
So for some it's demons, and for others it's what,
Aliens
god or alien
or
okay.
gods or computers, so depending on like it. But when it comes down to it, each of these things is not human. That's the point, is that each of these things will not, part of why they can enact
no care, no
the
love.
thing is because they don't identify with the human part of you,
Wow.
so they it's easier for them to see themselves as separate, as an outside entity that can keep all of this intact, because they
see themselves as a demon. I'm not a human, I'm a demon.
Yeah, or an alien entity, or like we said, like a god or a nature spirit,
right, or like Diana or who your Hecate, what they were doing for you, they were giving you goddesses, and
yeah, I mean and that was more like the occult stuff. So they were like
right,
almost the top of the hierarchy is what I would say. So they were like just below the top of the hierarchy. And for me, at the very top of the hierarchy, it was more, demonic, negative entity type stuff that was part of like a male part, which is, it's like more Habsburg imagery, with like the, which is also Roman and German, but the double-headed eagle basically was
right.
like the tippy top of my hierarchy, basically, which was, and part of like what it identified was, a complete like royalty type thing, male, and then also having this like demonic attachment. So between all of those things, identifying as like a little girl or an adult woman was like as far, you know what I mean? It's like no, like those are the things I rule over. That's not me. You know what I mean?
So like the chair in Eyes Wide Shut, there's the two-headed eagle, and then the crown above that. So like that's the Aries, that's the Aries king, and then his demon alongside him, and the crown they wear together, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it also represents like what you have with these hierarchy slaves, in general, like in the outside world, just when you're looking at like the levels of slaves that you have, is that you're going to have in all of these really intensely monarch program slaves, you're always going to have this like split programming between the front life and the occult life,
right.
So that's part
day
of the
self,
eagle.
night self, right?
Exactly. Is that it represents that, like, the overseeing of that split, between these two worlds, externally and internally, basically. But yeah,
Like
it's
the
like
keys of
also
Cybele and Janice, like what, like Janice is the doorway and he has the keys, right? And Cybele too, she's got the key And those are the
Yeah,
two
and
keys that the
there was
Pope
three
has.
keys like involved with like this particular eagle to where yeah, it's like they hold the keys to like the system overall. And then
Yeah.
below them, like we kind of mentioned the military hierarchy, below them, you know, they're gonna have the occult parts that are allied, you know, below them you're gonna have like the punisher parts, you know, like the executioners, you know, in the castle. And then below them you're going to have the dungeon, you know, which is essentially all of the traumatized parts that are, you know, what a dungeon is, you know, being held captive,
Yeah.
being brought out to torture, etc. You know,
The
and
old
then
ones or whatever, like this idea of like the anyway, please continue. I'm sorry.
no, that's fine, but that would pretty much encapsulate like the occult side of the system. But if we were to look at like the two systems, the occult side of the system, that whole thing is in hierarchy above the day-to-day life, you know, front life system, basically is there just yeah, just during your day-to-day life. We'll have skills for school and going to work and you know, being part of a family, you know, or having friends and having a somewhat more, you know, uh,
To
normal
look
present
normal, right?
to
Yeah.
yeah to mask all of the other stuff, you know. So that half of the system is kept, you know, incredibly. It not only has less power, but it has less overall knowledge of the system. Is much more, you know, amnesiac basically of everything, kept in the dark, and you know, very much manipulated behind the scenes from their subconscious, essentially from the occult hierarchy part of the system.
So we can imagine like the occult loyal um when we see Alice grooming Helena's hair and we see the green stars, the upside down stars and the curtains behind, and she's grooming the Satanism into her hair. We can imagine that Alice is the cult loyal personality and Helena is the front, like day-to-day personality who's just dumb, like whatever, I don't know. And then the
Mhm.
loyal one is like just, oh yeah, everything's fine, and just, you
Yeah,
know,
it's operating with like
primping and
complete knowledge,
yeah, right.
basically. And
As
then yeah,
if those two were both internal of yourself, say. Those are
mhm.
two in yeah, okay. That's how I was describing it for the listeners. I hope they understood. But anyway, please continue. I'm sorry, I'm stumbling.
Yeah, no, no, for sure. I think that was a complete thought. Maybe I forgot something.
No,
Um,
you're good. I'm the one that's stumbling around. So the so we understand these demons, loyalty and royalty are these ones are the most dissociated and they're the most horrific abused. And they don't even see themselves as human anymore. Uh,
yeah, and they're by far the hardest parts to heal for that reason. You know, is like they, you know, bring them to reality is much more difficult. Um, but it's also like where you get the most like
healing, the
yeah, the
most
most
done.
healing, the most like the most benefit, you know, in your own life as far as like the peace, like I said, the lack of, you know, it's sometimes it's horrible to know these things, but it's also better to know them if you went through them than to not know them. So it's like being on the other side of the amnesia and everything. It's, you know, when you make the cult out like allied parts allies to yourself, you know, and to really like recognize, oh, the cult are bad people, they tricked me, you know, there's all these other pain holding parts that I was dissociated from. I didn't even realize
I
a lot of
mean,
times
it
parts how
should
bad they
be
were.
easily logical, but to them, they're like you said, so cognitive dissonance. It's like
Mhm.
hard to convince, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Um so
So here, what about these clocks, carousels,
sorry, I'm looking at
elevators,
notes right now. Go ahead.
clocks, carousels, grids, webs, like so we're looking at the structure of this internal world. And
Yes.
how is that? How do you recognize what's what and what is, like, how do they? I mean, like I'll read Fritz Springmeier. I'll talk about, like, if they want to scare a victim, they'll make them see an hourglass, and, like, oh, time's running out, and they'll, like, remind specific things inside. You know what I mean? So please talk about that. I'm sure that's what this castles, trees, grids, moving clocks, carousels, elevators. Like, explain that for us,
Yeah,
please.
yeah. So, and this is like where it's like Fritz Springmeier has been so helpful, but also like is so like I
Tough
feel
to
like
get a
everyone.
hold of all of it. It's
Well,
tough.
I
God
mean,
bless him. Anyway, okay,
uh-huh.
sorry.
No, no, it's fine. And his work with Cisco Wheeler was just like super helpful
Amazing.
for me. But it
Yes.
it was also a little difficult in the fact that like it's written very matter of factly that like this what they're describing is in every is kind of like it gets presented as like what's in every system
All
basically
Illuminati
more.
does this.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
and what I would say is it's more like if you can read it, like when she's describing, like princess programming and like how that's like enacted and what parts enact different things, like in a different person's system based off of the script that their system's built off of. Those different parts will play the same roles. They'll have the same like archetypes and personas, but the actual identity will be different. So you might be dealing, like I said, with demon here. It might be like alien here, different stuff like that, basically. So
Crazy.
and so that's
Not crazy. I'm
so
sorry. It's,
no, no.
like, I'm not. This is very informative, and I'm not talking down or saying anything is bad or crazy. Like, it's just like unbelievable to me. That's all. I'm exasperating. Just like,
Yeah, yeah, no,
sorry.
that's fine. I mean, that's part of like why I was thinking this episode might be good because in the past I thought it wasn't as interesting to people, but I think ultimately it's like the kind of stuff that
This is the real why.
it it's like yeah, and it's the fish in the water thing for a survivor that's healing, but for outsiders, which is the vast majority of the world and the people that we need to like continue to educate so that we can get
Teach.
some
Yeah.
justice. Exactly. It's something that, it especially people reading, Fritz Springmeier's work, it's like you might not understand like a lot of the stuff that you're
Yeah.
reading,
Normal people reading, and then
it's so
yeah.
complex. So that was just this episode. I've been wanting to do something like this on my channel, like I mentioned, but this episode was really like I figured. We've talked a lot about my testimony. We've talked a lot about the events that I've gone through essentially in my life, but like what was the point of all of that essentially, and to get people like to start understanding, especially people who aren't multiples, kind of like what the internal landscape of like these survivors that we talk about are like. And that's what I'm saying. It's like this is my experience with stuff, but also there's way more commonality in my experience between survivors. Like I said, it's like the specifics are different, but the overall mechanisms
Right.
are very similar. So it'll just be traded out for different things in different systems, but they all play the same roles. So that's kind of like what
That makes sense.
mm-hmm.
Because everybody wants their own individual Lamborghini. Like, oh, I want my Lamborghini to be sized up specifically for my tastes of abuse, whatever,
Yeah, exactly. And the purpose of the just the brass tacks purpose of the slave, are they going to go into the military and special ops and be an assassin? Are they going to
Right.
be an occult priestess? Are they going to be, what are they going to be? Like, how do we mold this person's system to fit that basically and to reinforce those behaviors? Um, so I think when I wrote like the castles and trees, like castles are like ubiquitous in um, in
fantasy stories
survivor
everywhere.
programming. Not in
Oh,
everyone,
okay,
like,
I see. Right. Go ahead.
but
I'm
like,
gonna stop.
oh no, you're fine. Yeah, like castles, towers, yeah, labyrinth, the castle in the middle of the maze. Lord of the Rings, you have like the dark tower in the middle of Mordor, which was like what my personal, one was modeled after. You have, you look at Legend, you look at like so many, I mean, just so many different like fantasy movies and scripts and stuff, and you're going to have a dark castle in a dark land. Basically, it's kind of like Mind Palace related, to where it's like you can have different levels, different rooms. It makes it easy for the, not easy, but easier for the programmer to assign different parts to stay in different areas if they're literally internalized in the survivor's mind as like a castle with rooms in it. So you'll have other things too, because that's the nature of this stuff, but castles in particular, and they'll be different, for different survivors, are like really common. Um, uh, the tree thing I mentioned is like an overall structure, I think earlier. Planetary system, for an overall structure, if we were dealing with space programming. And then like grids, webs, different things that illustrate uh, where overall the system is put into like a literal, like grid that has like an XY axis or an XYZ axis, where they can, plot out where they would like different
Wow.
parts to live, and they
3D
have access.
XYZ, like
Yeah. So
Jesus.
when I describe my system, and I could have included an illustration of this stuff, because I have vast amount of illustrations of like system mapping and stuff like that.
I
I'm not
want to see it. Oh.
I might share with you, like
Okay, personally,
it
we don't have
feels
to share with the
very
audience.
well, and
But
that's part of why I did, is like it feels very personal to,
of
like,
course,
with my system, with everything,
it's like looking at a naked self. Like, yeah,
pretty much,
I get it.
it's
Yeah,
like your mind, it's like you see the overall structure. And so for me, when it came to gatekeeper type altars, like altars, that were more computer minded or demonic minded, that were meant to, they were supposed to know the overall structure that they wanted me to internalize. I was shown this in physical reality, basically. So like that's a memory that I have, is, several parts that were supposed to internalize this structure, being in an area that was, like a completely empty, like aircraft hangar. It was like a massive like building. And it's like you were on like I mean, the closest I've been to is like in flight simulator type rooms, where it's like halfway up the room of this massive room, there will be uh, like metal walkways, essentially, so it's like you're kind of in the middle of this structure. You're not at the bottom, and big, empty, dark, and there was like fluorescence, basically, that kind of that three-dimensional fluorescent light bulb crafted sculpture, basically,
wow.
that was coated with colors, essentially, and then coated with the overall structure, basically. So like points where you have lines joining, and then what's very, very common for most survivor system, I don't think there isn't a form of this in any I've learned about, which is like a central elevator channel, which is where, the parts move from these various locations up, like inward and like up into the consciousness, basically, when there's a switch that happens. So all of this is like physically illustrated to like my child self, to where it's like they're like, okay, this is the structure of your system. It's like basically like kind of hourglassy, like two diamonds stacked on top of each other, and you have different nodes. Those describe where different altars live. You have different sections of this geometric structure. Those are where the different worlds live. And then for me too, when it comes into clocks and stuff like that, like, and dealing with timing stuff, or them knowing like which part is on which node, is that it was very much geared towards like a clock, basically. So like round 12 points essentially, and that one part was geared with seeing the overall structure from the side, and then another part that was in charge of like the clockwork aspect of things. And we can get into carousel programming too, but essentially they were shown like a top view of it, so it was more seeing like the layering of stuff as like a circular, like clock face almost. So these are literal, like, so this is like a literal structure that was built to be shown to me as a child
and
for
lit
the
up in those specific points, and was like, there's Diana's right there in
mm-hmm.
that, in the upper triangle, in this quadrant, and like that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's pretty much, so that's how they have access to things. It's how they, ensure
And
that you have.
your memory, like your photographic memory of the whole thing when you're a kid, so it's in there. It's always in there as like your blueprint. You can just refer back to it and just make sure it lines up right.
Mm-hmm.
Right, basically, right? I mean, that's
Yes. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of what was really validating to me, was because I got all of this information as I was healing and dealing with, the memories of this stuff actually being implanted. And then I would go and like read other people's, like Springmeyer, or like just like Chainless Slaves, other people who had like written about this stuff, and to see almost like word for word, or the stuff I had journaled about, seeing it recreated in these other areas, just to be like, yeah, these are just templates, that they use, that they've learned,
it's
are very
amazing. I mean, just
effective.
I mean, like the potential of our brains to do this. I mean, like, let alone all the torture and all the abuse and what the immorality of it all. Like, oh my God, humans
Yeah.
can remember that and do that. That's amazing.
Yeah. It's pretty wild, yeah. And
Wow.
yeah, and then I think, so I went over elevators and like the
Right.
clocks.
The clocks, and so these are like
Yeah.
the things inside, or is this I mean,
Yeah,
do
so
you
that
get
so that
triggered when
part,
you see a clock? I mean,
no. I mean,
okay,
I'm horrible with
that's what
time.
you're saying.
Really typical with
Me
like,
too.
people. like cannot conceptualize time. Very bad
It's
at it.
tough. It's tough. It's imaginary, but go ahead.
Yeah. um but there are parts of me that can 100%, because they were geared to understand the timing of things, basically. We
Right.
could look at the timing thing with the clock, is that like this kind of clockwork computer type part that was shown, the above view of stuff, is that like clockwork, they would have, I'd mentioned the nursery rhyme earlier, there's hickory dickory dock, the mouse
Yes.
went down the clock.
Please, for the
Okay, so
listeners, one more time, let's do that, because that was a different episode. Hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck one. And how does it go, please? Do you
to be
remember?
honest,
I
I'm
know,
like
the
basic,
clock
right?
struck one, and then and then the mouse
And the
runs.
mouse ran down hickory dickory dock. Yeah,
Yeah.
so basically, for me it was, this uh these altars were like teamed up to where there was the um, you know clockwork computer type altar that was keeping track of all of this stuff, and also keeping track of switches that they had wanted to happen at certain times. And one of them was every night for this cleanup programming to happen, where there would be literal, like, from it internally, would come like little mice that were all color coded to the four different systems, that would essentially like run into, like a little mouse hole, like run into the rooms of all of the different altars, basically, to make sure that they
In their
were
dungeon
used system.
caverns, these little mice can visit in the each little cavern hole that all of them are.
Yeah, exactly. All the different places that the programmers had programmed, like there was a mouse that was programmed to go as like a diagnostic, essentially, to make sure, like, check in on that part secretly real quick to make sure that like things were running properly,
It's
and
crazy because
not,
Douglas
and
Adams, the Hitchhiker's Guide, like the
mhm,
mice are the ones that are keeping track of everything, and the ones that are running the whole system. Like the Earth is like is a clockwork device run by mice. It's crazy. All right.
I love that
But
movie.
it's me
I haven't
too.
read the book.
The books are way better. But yeah,
I
it's
can imagine.
and it's like pure imagination too. But that so this like I mean this pure imagination is really how humans can get all this. I mean, this what you told me about that X, Y, and Z axis and shown to you visually. I mean, I've never heard anything like that. That's, I mean, oh my God. Um, so this is, it's built within you, and you are continually rebuilding every night, making sure all that structure is held in the proper place, and you're, fixing it up every night with like cleaning
Yeah.
program.
Yeah, you would have, so basically you would be dealing with like reprogramming parts that night, but then also the next day you would be dealing with like a hangover of like, okay, if there were things that you were doing to like disobey, that's where the punishment programming comes in, to where in your conscious life, the system diagnostics will be like, hey, like these things are, not right. We have to, run this other program to where you're going to be dealing with all of this, emotional upset or body pain,
That's
different
the
stuff,
emotional
like,
fuel.
yeah, to push you back into the box that you're supposed to be in, into the line of thinking you're supposed to be in, etc.
Right.
um so yeah. It's like, it's yeah, it's
Oh,
pretty, it's ridiculously elaborate, and it's like a lot of why, Labyrinth and the Maze is very appropriate, because that is what surrounds getting to hierarchy, and everything is like this very intensely planned, essentially booby trapped maze that's created
right.
by the abusers to kind of create as many obstacles as possible to the healing and discovery of this kind of stuff. um
Right.
yeah, I think
And
the
you
other
wrote here
had there.
reinforces the believability to the programmed parts and internalized belief in occult power. Can you talk about that a little bit? That kind of goes along with what you're just saying.
Yeah, well, and that's pretty much what I had described about before, with the rituals, were like wearing the robes, all of the different props, or in other scenarios, like I talked about the unicorn programming before, like it was something that literally, like, you're dressed like a unicorn and you're given, that was another instance with some LSD, and I was in an area of the bunker that was called the Gates termed it the pleasure garden. I had been there multiple times for different things, but this time was like the first time, and it was essentially like, it was like a magical land, it was like
Huh.
outside with a running brook, and like, and feels like sunlight and everything. It's underground, you know what I mean? But it's a vast room, that
Huh.
has plants, and just like is meant to be like this very idyllic, you know. I had later had goddess programming there at like, kind of a gazebo type thing, to where it was like a royalty experience. Same location, different area
Underground.
in that. Yeah. So this is completely underground. But is there.
This is like, but this is the kind of bunkers that these rich people want when they're done with the nuclear war. They want to live under there, and they're going to have this. It's going to be like, they're just going to be like, just like outside, and we're going to have our little victims in the grass. And wow, that's what
Yeah.
the Doctor Strangelove. He's like, oh, we can have this many, victims in our tunnels for 50
Hmm.
years. Like, and he's doing the
Yeah.
math. And oh my God, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and it serves the purpose. So, and that's kind of what I would say with the rituals, is like it serves the purpose of being sets for, you know, pornography they're making is service a purpose of serving as sets for the
Snuff
training
films.
that they're doing, but ultimately all of this system building is based off of like convincing a small child of certain things, basically. So the more elaborate and believable you can make this setting, whether that's a ritual and people with robes and the fire and all that stuff to amp up terror, if that's what they're after, or this other thing, each time it's like they're really going to it's part of how they know this spell, this convincing of this kid is going to work, because they're going to have a completely believable, experience. And it also, like I said, with the occult stuff is that, if like ultimately they're trying to really convince the kid that they're all powerful and inescapable, and so they have to do things that make it seem like that, things like making it seem like they're omniscient, having a kid do something that no one should know about, and then they call them out on it, basically, and they're like, well, they can't see me anywhere. Or maybe a day ago they programmed you to do that thing and then made you forget about it.
Well, there's a part inside of you that's tattling to them and you don't know about it. And so, of course, they must seem omniscient, like they know everything because you're telling them everything, but you don't know it.
Or you're doing, like I was mentioning, you're doing something that you think is your own free will, but is actually something they programmed in you in a day to a week before, to where subconsciously they was going to push you into making that decision. And then they're going to be like, see, like whatever, you know what I mean? Like that they know is basically your life. And it's like, you're either tattling on them or you're enacting things without your own knowledge, basically. So all of that goes a long way into convincing the survivor that they're like in an inescapable situation, and that any occult power that these people claim to have, and power over you, therefore, is 100% legitimate. You're not even going to question it. And that's the belief of a child that you bring into your whole life. You're an adult and you can look back on this scenario once you've dealt with the flashback and be like, hey, these are all the ways that they tricked you. This is the lengths that they went through to do this stuff, to make this very elaborate lie very believable, and that's like how you get rid of a lot of the power, and why it's so important to address the kids' memories, because a lot of times that's the only memory they have. So they have no context, outside context, that like movie sets like this can exist or different stuff, it's like, and then you can look back on it and be like, hey, and part of integrating too is that these parts are very isolated to the trauma event. So when part of doing the memory work and integrating is that you start dealing with the parts on either side too, essentially. And once they all realize it was all a continuum, like the part that remembers going to the bunker essentially for this programming ritual, like the part that was in the programming ritual, that's like their whole reality. And they don't realize that, hey, I was a kid asleep in my bed, essentially, just an hour ago. And then, get brought into, can remember going through the bunker doors, can remember going down the hallways and everything, and getting to the place where then they initiate a switch on you. And then that new part, this is their whole reality. It's the pleasure garden. They don't have any context for how they got there. This is just the world. This is reality, and then the part that then, comes in when they've completed their training, and then you wake up, a lot of times they would drug me so I would be like asleep on the way home, and then you wake up in bed and you're just like, the front part of you is just like, was that a dream? They may have like pain holder parts to dissociate the pain to a degree in varying levels. You'll have some bleed through, but it's like, the part in the middle that has been programmed to have these really intense beliefs needs to get connected with the part before and after to see, hey, this is how I got there. And there's nothing magical there. There was no magic involved. It was like,
right. Most important, convince them of
exactly. And once you can show them that like there was no magic involved, that all this power they felt like their abusers had, etc. And they can look at it from an adult's eyes, then it takes a lot of the power away from those parts believing their roles and still choosing to enact on them.
So the separation of the part keeps it like that even more, keeps it firm in its separation. Like,
Mm-hmm.
wow. Okay. But the convincing, it takes, you got to show them how unbelievable it is.
Mm-hmm.
And like how obviously it's not like a loving human acts in a loving way. And you have to train them, show them like, oh, this is what love,
Yeah.
because they've only experienced that one thing that's separated. Like they
Mm-hmm.
don't know what else is there. They don't even...
Yeah.
Wow. You got to convince them, hey, love exists. Like, hey,
Yeah.
you don't have to be afraid. You can be the other side. You can be happy in love.
Even in the case of animal altars or these inhuman altars that we were talking about, like literally getting them to recognize that they're not an animal or like a clockwork computer eagle, or, you know what I mean? Like,
or tape recorder or a seashell.
like the wolves and dogs and stuff like
Or
that. Make you realize,
right.
hey, I don't normally live in a kennel.
Right.
It goes a long way to being like, okay, like maybe I am just a kid part that took on this persona
Right.
because,
But,
I was put through all this stuff. If you can see how
right,
you
but you
got there.
wanted to be in the kennel because then they weren't going to abuse you if you're in that cage, right? I mean, you told us about
Yeah.
that before. It was your safe space. Like,
Well, and that part totally thought they did identify with a dog. They had done a lot of
yeah,
things to get me to like for that part to literally identify themselves as a dog. So it's like you're thinking like a dog, and
right.
so much of the healing really is
Hunt.
just being like, hey, you are a
Right.
human.
Right.
This is but it's also tends to be very relieving always for these parts because like I said, it's like they like once they see that there's a choice in like being the identity that they took on or being your actual identity, like every time they're gonna choose that. So
God gave free will to every single one of you.
yeah, pretty much.
That's amazing. It's
Getting them all to realize it though, that's the struggle.
But that's the one they can all say no, and they can all turn away. Like what the show talks about for like what we're supposed to be saying to the authority the whole time. No, I choose
Do not
love.
consent. Do not consent
Yes.
to this rule, like I'm a
Yeah.
free person. Like there's no reason to be jumping through these stupid hoops.
Right. And then they can find all the other yous, selves that have all jumped away from that programming and been safe and caught by you saying, hey, this is us, welcome. I'm like,
Yeah.
right.
Like when I look at this, like the 35 to 36 switch that we've talked about a bunch, like it's making those parts realize that they're the ones that are enacting the abuse now, like not the abusers or the ones that are like, and it's like, are you choosing, should we choose to like put ourselves in a worse situation? Like whenever I was dealing with like intense, like triggers for reprogramming or different stuff like that, it was always the same thing where, it would be a part that came up to intentionally either send me to the mental hospital or to intentionally like run away from my life and essentially like either isolate myself camping or like in a hotel or something like that. And it would feel like an overwhelming urge, that's what I needed. I could not, and it's like real, like getting those parts to realize, like we're we're so afraid of them accessing us that we feel like we have to get away, but getting away is the thing that makes us accessible. So it puts us in a vulnerable position for those things to happen. So that's what a lot of this programming is about, is like you're forcing the slave into putting themselves into vulnerable positions, essentially, like the likelihood they were going to like roll up and kidnap me very low. The likelihood that they're going to gun down a survivor, very low. But the likelihood that they're going to have the survivor choose to kill themselves, or choose to walk into a reprogramming type scenario, is much higher. That is what a lot of this programming is for, is so that, if this time switch is supposed to be happening and this is what you're supposed to be doing, you're going to have an overwhelming urge to do this kind of stuff. And it's, what you have to, it's like part of like what you recognize as idiosyncratic with your actual life, you know what I mean? And
like an alcoholic.
And showing these kind of, and because they are
to
addicted to
recognize
this completely false reality,
Right.
and you have to be like, hey, like the thing you're afraid of, you're going to make happen by choosing, because that is the program is convincing you, that you have to do this thing in reaction to this feeling. But instead, it's going to make you accessible in the way that they want you to, and you're really going to be, so you're choosing to walk into the hands of your abusers, basically.
Right. And then you just like you want another drink, and then like, oh, pour me another. You know what I mean? Like it's feeding itself. But this way, and the compulsion to do that and to get away and to run back to them is just like every time, like we alcoholics, have a bad idea or thought, and oh, I want to get high, oh, I want to drink, just put it away, get that memory, it's like it's a trigger, and you're just doing compulsively, and like, so it's like trying to convince a million alcoholics inside of you to like quit the cult of quit drinking the spirits, right?
Yeah, accurate. Yeah, for sure. So I was gonna say,
did I derail you?
No, that's totally fine. I was just glancing to see if there was like anything we were forgetting in that like column there, because we pretty much made it through the whole thing. I think the only other thing that I didn't mention was just like memory storage, which is just basic. I can go over that every survivor is just like you have an area for storing like trauma memories. They're going to have areas for storing blackmail events, information you were supposed to gather, different, like pretty much not just the amnesia, in general, but just need to know what's seen as, classified, off limits, whatever information, they don't want you to not have it, because the point of you gathering that information is to be able to relay it to your handlers, but they don't want you to have access to it either. So you'll have like, memory banks, libraries, this kind of some sort of like information filing structure that they can access as well.
Right. Like mental files, right? Like Bryce Taylor, Sue Ford talks about how Kissinger used her as a filing system to like organize and to be his, like so yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Wow. So this, let's bring it back to the Mothers of Darkness and how like they have the way that they programmed you with this 3D structure of, and you have internally little mice keeping it in order. They, and in the larger macro, are the same with the internal structures of all the important slaves, I guess. They like organize it. They have the keys to them. They're directing the breeding of them. So like, basically that's why the Mothers of Darkness is so intricately connected to this programming stuff. Like everybody's all Mothers of Darkness. Oh, it's a castle. Oh, they got 350 window, 365, ooh. But really like the the significance is they hold, like the way that you held the structure 3D in your head, they hold the larger structure in their, larger cognition of their mastermind, I guess. Like,
I don't know if I would
I
say
don't know how to
that
describe it.
necessarily.
Please.
Yeah. No, I was just saying, I don't know if I would like, if you're looking at just the occult order side of this, like to a degree, for me, it was always the people that seemed more in charge of like the overall hierarchy of the world, or even, were the ones creating my overall hierarchy, and system structure. When we were talking about like the structure I was shown and stuff, it was all military basically. So the Mothers of Darkness programming was an aspect of like my overall system, and everything, and a big part of it, because they did, like, the occult rituals were generally the most traumatizing things. But overall, at least in my experience, the the vast like structure, was created by military. But yes, like the
I
Mothers
see.
of Darkness were
But
the ones.
the occult self, the occult hierarchy one, right? The
Mhm.
military stuff is the functional hunter tracker, right?
Yeah. So it was like it was really like it was a team effort, But yeah, so they were anything that required occult programming, which was not everything in my system, they were involved with, so they were involved with like the main ceremony, creating like the occult channeling type part, with doing like the sacred prostitute, huntress type part, and then with like the double-headed eagle, which was the ultimate head of the system. But it's like they dealt with very little of like, other than doing those like kind of like almost like sealing rituals, like where they really like just kind of, I don't know how to describe it, like created the um
Base platform for the rest of them to grow, sprout out of.
to a degree, yeah, that it's like they were there to kind of like ordain the system heads with these like very intense ritual traumas, but um it was high up in the hierarchy, but like most of the system was not Mothers of Darkness
I
created,
see. So they're
So
not
I don't know
mapping.
if that
Okay.
if that makes sense. It's like
Yeah,
they
it
probably
does.
dealt with like 10%, maybe even 5% of my structure. They were the most powerful ones, but pretty much everything else was created through like mostly like the military involved training and trauma and stuff like that.
And your in quotes owner was a military guy, and that was his station in life, so it makes sense for that. But so I guess I was, in my mind when I was structuring that, I was thinking of how they are keeping track of the occult programming
Hmm.
of all of the important slaves,
Yes.
and they're in that way they're also directing I mean, your military programming doesn't care if you're going to breed with this person or whatever, that person, like, your military programming wants you to be a dog and hunt, right? Like, these ones want you to be a queen that has,
Hmm.
so of course it's um separate and different and distinct. uh but
And
yeah,
you're,
so I'm
not
trying to
wrong. I just
imagine
wanted to like
the
help people.
occult, right? Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No. I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just saying you're not wrong. I was just trying to help people like conceptualize, like,
I'm
I don't know.
often wrong, it's
Just
okay.
yeah, just no. Just what I went through, just to be like, most of the programming is all like very not occult related. It's going to involve electroshock. It's going to involve, later on, like VR and like frequency and split
Right.
hemisphere stuff. Even this time where I was shown the system structure, that was like a military, like, airplane hangar. Basically, it was
Yeah.
all like, I was with my military handlers,
Right.
and I was in, that kind of structure and everything.
Okay. Wow. So that is the military mind that creates that three-dimensional grid.
Yeah,
So that makes sense. Yeah, the Mothers of Darkness would be a more of a right brain mind, wouldn't it?
yeah. Which it is like. So when it comes to the hierarchy, especially on the occult side, it's like they were the ones that like, um, you know, it's like once those parts were created, it's like they're the ones that it's like you have to increase the trauma each time to create a split off of like an already traumatized part. So they were the ones that did like kind of like the most, intense, showy,
Most
like
believable.
yeah, exactly. Like the demonization type one was like one of the most like grisly type of ones that I had to like witness and like somewhat participate in. But then also like I said, like hallucinogen type stuff being used to really, convince you of these things. So it's like my military programs determine what the overall structure they wanted for me
Right.
was. And then they, brought in these, and because I had the role in the occult, that's what they brought in to like to do the trauma of the hierarchical parts to where they really internalized that role that was very different than than my actual existence. So I mean they work symbiotically, these two different groups. They have two different ultimate like interests in me,
Yeah.
but it all kind of works together, like the military very logic based stuff as well as the occult, it's like, I keep coming up with the word like it's like a seal, a solidifying, of those parts with like what they see as like the occult powers that they possess to really like, imbue you with this entity involvement or this identity of that,
This is true. This magic is real.
Yeah,
Ooh.
exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And then I'm not sure if you're
Kind
like,
of
I
like the
think we,
Bene Gesserit puts your hand in the box and like believe your hand is being burned, right? And then
uh-huh,
like so that and then but really but it's the belief and they're controlling
mhm,
the mind. It's
exactly.
yeah. But the
Exactly.
belief has to be you have to convince that child it's unbelievable. Pull your hand
Mhm.
out, it's fine. It's okay. Like
Yeah.
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 That's great. I
Um,
have had you for a long time. Is this are
no,
we
no, I was
okay?
gonna say, I think we actually did like pretty much hit everything on my outline, I mean, unless there's anything that you're seeing that I'm missing, but I think for the most part, we went over all of it, which
Beautiful.
bravo. I thought we were gonna have to do another part to this, and maybe we will if we want to just get into like different types of altars or something. Maybe we've covered that enough.
I'd be glad to
Yeah.
what I mean if like you it's fruiting out of your consciousness. So I am here to uh give you fertile ground for your voice to plant seeds, you know. So when you feel the need, you tell me and if like anytime I would love to go further on this or if you are inspired to speak on something else in the future, I look forward to our future endeavors. Every time I'm amazed and happy and like, um, yeah, like, and I'm learning so much, like, and it all makes sense now from the artistic point of view. Like, you being an artist has really helped to describe for us and to show us, and like, for me especially, it's very helpful. And I'm glad that you're doing all the art and you're like journaling all the stuff because this is important information. I mean, if even if you don't get it out onto podcasts or whatever, like get it documented somewhere. Do just keep doing what you're doing. I mean, you're amazing. It's so Okay, I think I've pretty much talked about what I wanted to talk about too. So this what they were intending for you to program was the belief that you are this separate demon thing that is meant to be this way, and but really it's all just a show of fiction. And you know, it's like the Wizard of Oz. I mean, there's the curtain, and it's just a person telling you lies, blah blah blah. You know, it's just, it's and they're powerless. You have all the power. Like they have made the perfect weapon with you, and your artistic abilities have like really made you more effective. And like you said on imagination with Emma, you're like, if I saw him on the street, he'd be scared of me. And it's like, that's so powerful, and it's true. Because I mean, you've got all this truth, and you can just show everything. And like, you know, you can tell us who he is, and we look him up, and like, oh my God. Like, you can read what he says about himself, and like understand in the context of the way that you talk about him. Like, so for any justice to happen, like normal people, not like anybody's normal, but I mean, uh, the masses need to hear your story, and they need to look up this dude, Julius William Gates. They need to look at his ugly face, and all of these perpetrators have a face. And this hierarchy they're all just losers. Tell us about that. Talk about that.
Did you say about my dad?
No, I know I said talk about that. Talk about that. How they're all just losers. But yeah, your dad,
Oh, yeah.
your
Sure.
mind put him in there, and it makes sense because he's just a loser too.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
he's
They don't
abusing
mention
you while he's
on the
watching
podcast.
like snuff porn. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
he's abusing his own child while he's watching people die. I mean, holy
yeah. Frank
shit.
Olaje, he's someone I don't mention
Frank
his name
Olaje.
super often, but yeah, that's him.
He's a
That
person.
these people are people. He's occupational therapist. He's still alive, still an alcoholic. It's like and that's part of why I speak out in general is because the justice system has failed survivors so many times. And when I tried entering it too, it was the same. So it's like this is our
It is run by them. The justice
justice.
system
Yeah.
is theirs. Like,
Yeah, the justice
they
is
wear
going to
black robes, and there's 9 of them. Like, anyway, yeah. So,
yeah.
I mean,
No, it's true. It's like that's where justice comes from, is like people still knowing their deeds, even if like we're not allowed to, they won't like take us seriously in like prosecuting this kind of stuff, then it's like, well, it's like I can at least tell my story, and hopefully it'll help people understand what's involved with all of this, and help survivors get free if they've
yes.
been involved in it too. So
And
but yeah, I would
hopefully
love to come on
their
again.
world will crumble out from under them, like the
It
structure
already is.
they have built on lies. I mean, you have all these mountains of truth, and they're like at this card house of cards, just all you got to do is just go whew, and everything will fall apart. Like, really, it's and especially
Get
with
there.
the astrology, everything is changing. Like, I mean, it's really, they have nothing left to stand on. And I mean, with all of your words, the more you speak, the the less they can do about it, the less they can even try to hurt you. What are they going to do? Like, you already said everything. I mean, you said who they are and what they did, and like you said what their plans were, and like you told us I mean, and you teach us how those of the listeners that were abused like you, that are still under the control of the spirits, like the alcoholic, they're still like, they can't, they're trapped, you know, you're there for them. Like your show, Desert Zucchini, on YouTube, and you're gonna have an Odyssey channel and a BitChute and a Rumble too, maybe, right?
Yeah, well, that's my goal. Is like to diversify as much as possible for
It's
sure. 'Cause
easy.
who knows
It's
what
easy.
the future holds, you know?
That's right. But really, like, YouTube tries to put you in a box. Like, you can't, they can't stifle it because, oh, YouTube is going to censor you. Oh, right. Well, Odyssey pops up, and then, like, so the real truth will happen. Like, the justices won't give justice. Okay. You're going to talk with me about it. And then somebody who's listening is going to do something, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, a
We're
lot
going
of
to
people
open our
use that
mouths and let that
as
happen.
the masses, it's just more and more people are learning about this stuff, and the
Yeah.
more people we'll hit a critical mass eventually of number of people that believe it and know it, that there's going to be some accountability held, because
I hope so.
it's just going to be an undeniable issue, and most people are good. I'm convinced of, so.
Yeah.
But
That's
yeah,
right.
I mean,
We're born
also in
good.
your
That's, I
episode, if
mean,
there's anything that you want to talk about too, like I'm totally down. I never know if you have questions that come in from people, or areas that people would like to hear more about. Like I'm up
right.
for whatever.
Do
So
you have, I mean, uh, do you have a couple minutes to talk about something that somebody just shared with me in an email to talk to you about? I mean,
sure,
I,
probably briefly,
okay.
if
All right. So have you heard about this? Here, I'll share it. Um, this here, uh, Vanessa Beeley, girls raped in ritual ceremonies reveal the horrors. Investigative report. The darkest ritual abuse exists in Israel, as proven by decades of child abuse, rape, and pedophilia. Recent investigative report by journalist Naam Barkan for Israel Hayam has revealed the depths of debauchery in Israeli society. This is something that I have written about previously
no,
that you
I'm
can
not
read here.
familiar with it, but
Hmm.
maybe I can.
I'll share with this. I'll
Yeah,
share
share
you.
it with me, and then maybe
Vanessa
we'll.
Beeley is she she's anti-war and anti New World Order. She's trying to, from her journalistic perspective, she has encountered this um, people, abuse survivors like yourself.
Yeah, I would love to learn more about it.
I will share this with you. And yeah, so somebody sent me an email and they said, "Hey, have you seen this? And it'd be great if you could talk to Carrie, and it'd be great if Carrie could talk to Vanessa." So maybe that can happen someday. Maybe you can teach Vanessa about the reality of what she's just discovering. You know?
Yeah, more and more people are going to be in that position. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the truth is you can't hold it in. You can't hold it down. So. Um, and it's, I mean, total war and evil over there, so of course it's rearing its ugly head.
Yeah, it's really disgusting. I've been
Oh shit,
calling
I
it
was,
out for over a decade now, and it's like it's horrible that it's taken this much to finally become
yeah.
common knowledge for people. But
Well, I mean, that's real. I mean, that, not that, whatever, that is believed by normies, news article, you know what I mean, that can be traded with normies, and they're like, that have never heard of anything like ritual abuse, and they can see that for the first time, be like, what? And they understand with this war situation and these people being thrown away, and like, it's just like it's a grindhouse of evil. Makes sense. So now people can finally cognize it, you know. And you've been here this whole time, like, hello.
Yeah, other people have been for longer too, you know.
Oh,
But
of course, yeah. Kathy O'Brien, God bless her, and like, I mean, I'm just so glad that, and you know, and your voice is no different than theirs. I mean, it's not. Everyone is distinct and has their own. But I mean, it has the same purpose. It's for domination. It's to control another. It's like total slavery, and that's, you know, when they want to make a human a slave, this is how it's done, and it's scientific. And they figured it out, all these scientists, for all these hundreds of years. And just be a psychopath, it's fine, go ahead. You know, and like, you know, power is like, oh good, yeah, we'll take that, okay, well, yeah, okay. Well, thank you.
of course, it was a pleasure as always, you know, coming on and you giving me the platform to talk about all of this. Like, I really appreciate it. I hope it'll be some help in the world. You're, you know, a fantastic, you know, interviewer and compassionate and amazing human, you know, and you're on the right side of history. That's for sure. So it's always a pleasure to come and talk to you. It's like, you know, one of the most, you know, laid back, but it's like, I do feel like it's hopefully always informative to people and
Yes.
and helpful in the long term, you know. So thanks for being on my team.
I can't think of any other way. I mean, I am myself, and we are on a team together somehow. This is the reality. Like, I love it. I'm so glad that we can work together on this endeavor of speaking the words into the ears of people who are interested enough to listen. Because if they're interested enough to listen, then they might be interested enough to do something. So
Yeah.
we're getting there.
We are.
God bless you. Thank you.
You
All
too.
right. Everybody needs to visit Desert Dakini and look forward to your future endeavors. And I look forward to our future conversations. And I am sure we will have them recorded for our listeners to look forward to as well. Thank you again. Thank you, listeners, for listening. We'll see you next time on Wake the Dead.